The study session for the City Council for the City of Wheat Ridge, Colorado for December 18, 2017. Thank you all for being here. For the record, all of the city councilors are present, as is our city manager and our city clerk. So our first item on the agenda is citizens' comment on agenda items, and our first speaker is Mr. Bob Bazell, and Mr. John Fielding is on deck.
Bob Razzle, 3830 Carr Street. I'm here tonight.
Would you spell your name?
B-R-A-Z-E-L-L. I'm here tonight to speak about our R1C neighborhood. Neighbors are supposed to look after one another for their mutual good, so everyone in the area can feel safe, raise their children, and obtain happiness as a community. So there must be give and take by everyone. Some of the people moving into the area, I'm afraid, only want to take. Building a 2- or 3-story house with a flat roof, adding a deck on or near the top, takes your neighbor's view away, so you can have one. Takes your neighbor's privacy away, takes your neighbor's sunshine away, and most important, takes your neighbor's quality of life away. So they can have what they want. That's not very neighborly, it's downright selfish. I'm not sure we want to see this kind of selfishness in Wheat Ridge. Let them buy or move to Arvada, Lakewood, or Denver. Our neighboring city to the south, Edgewater, which for the most part mirrors our R1C area in lot size and so on, seems to have addressed this same issue, and I think fairly responsibly. They have instituted a 28-foot maximum height on houses with a pitch roof, minimum pitch of 612. 25-foot maximum house on flat roofs. I would also add to this, and they may very well have, I don't know, nothing to exceed the height restriction except chimneys and vent pipes, in order to prevent decks on top of flat roofs of houses to ensure the privacy of others. I hope that the City Council of Wheat Ridge would show as much concern and compassion for the established long-term residents of this city as Edgewater Council has for theirs. Thank you.
Thank you. John Fielding with Dorothy Archer on deck.
Hi, everybody. My name is John Fielding, F-I-E-L-D-I-N-G. I live at 3240 J Street. Before I get to the meat of the sandwich, I want to thank Mr. Goff, Mr. Tardif, who's not here, and Monica Duran for helping me with my roofing problems when nobody else would. They did it in lightning speed, and a sincere thanks. I also want to thank council for letting me speak my opinion. One thing I think we can all agree on, we like the small town feel we have here in Wheat Ridge. The parks, the open spaces, the view of the mountains, and the sense of community and respect that most of us enjoy. This is why we live here. If council votes to let people build 35-foot towers, we all lose. 25 feet is more than enough. please vote a resounding no on 35 feet. It will start a rush of people behaving badly, building ugly houses, popping the tops on existing houses, diminishing the rich historic value of older homes, while blocking out the summer breeze, the sunlight, the views, while saying the heck with everyone else. I don't care. Is this what you want for your children, your children's children? The legacy that we will leave of disregard and respect of everyone around them? Do you want them to grow up like this? No. There will be more people, more noise, more traffic, a lot less tranquility, respect, and willingness for all of us to get along. Wheat Ridge is not Denver. We are Wheat Ridge. This is why we live here. Merry Christmas and happy holidays to everybody. And wasn't that an incredible sunset tonight? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Fielding. Our next speaker is Dorothy Archer with Vittoria Mendoza on deck.
Dorothy Archer, 3640 Marshall Street.
And I guess just spell your name too.
I apologize for last week. I didn't even acknowledge mayor, council, and citizens when I approached the stand. Thank you. Thank you again for allowing us to be heard. I won't take the whole evening. I'm just going to say the last two who spoke, 100% behind it. I'm here in favor of R1C and R3, backing them 100%. I want that to be carried to R1 and R2. Please keep us who we are. We don't need to bring in the 335 foot. We don't need to do that. Our homes are sold immediately. People coming in buy here because they love it. Why don't we keep it that way for them? Thank you and Merry Christmas to you.
Thank you, Ms. Archer. Our next speaker is Vittoria Mendoza and Jesse Hill on deck.
Good evening. My name is Vittoria Mendoza, M-E-N-D-O-Z-A, and I live in 3021 Chase Street. I live in the southeast corner of Wheat Ridge, where most of the houses with R1C zoning are located. These are the neighbors that are speaking today. I want to remind everybody, even though we know that we are talking about a small corner of the entire Wheat Ridge. We are not wanting this for all of the buildings in Wheat Ridge. We're talking about the small area that makes 11% of Wheat Ridge that has that configuration that we are all talking about and that we love so much. I am here to ask the council members to set a height limit of 25 feet for new residential buildings in this area. The current limit is 35 feet, and this is too tall for this area for a residential dwelling. The city of Edgewater, our neighbors south of us, and with homes similar to those in my area, that southeast corner that we are talking about with R1C zoning, want also to keep their integrity and recognize that the height of 35 is excessive and reduce it to 25, 28 with all the specifics that one of our previous residents talked about. Members of the council, please reduce the maximum height allowed to new buildings in southeast Wheat Ridge to 25 feet. This needs to be addressed and decided soon. A delay deciding on this new height limit of 25 feet might and can permanently change the look and feel of this area and the character that we love so much. Southeast Wheat Ridge, where I am asking for 25 feet of height limit, is zoned mostly R1C. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Mendoza. Jesse Hill and Benny Gonzales on deck.
Hello, Council. Jesse Hill, 2995 Chase Street and 3001 Chase.
And would you spell your name, please?
Jesse, Hill, Hill. It's tough to count all the hours I've worked at the, I don't know, bulk plane and elevation stuff here with the city, coming to these meetings and countless nights of lost sleep. But I'm glad I checked my email on Thursday to know that this was coming up here. Not everyone who has interest in this topic is here tonight, so I'll do my best to cover it. I am the guy that has felt, I guess, the pain of the current 15-foot bulk plane pain out there when it comes to designing a house, and it has been very, very difficult to even work through that out there. So, I mean, I personally wish we'd revisit that if we're going to revisit and put a 17-foot or adjust the base plane. But I'm going to focus on what the staff did here and the really great work of actually putting together some graphics for you guys to show already the current restrictions on with the 15-foot bulk plane. You already can see there was a dramatic restriction out there of the vertical and just building area that we've got out on the thing. In general, too, that's the best case scenario. In reality, there's slope lots. In reality, you actually have a little smaller lots than what's described on there. You know, it really forces the design to conform to already. The new house is already going to be there. So you lose certain architectural styles, say with a cross gable roof, you know, because you have to have the front of it point to a steeple up front, or dormers can be very difficult to work in. And they're necessary to have stairs, and it's just really tough to get a variance even considered, because the general hardship just says, well, just don't build one, or just don't do it. You're doing that to yourself. So the variance process is not easy for those who have to run into this. So, you know, the biggest part is it's ironic that if you look at these images and how it really plays out, is it's going to end up forcing taller, blockier, flat roof structures if we do any more limitation on this, and even how it is now. Especially if you're interested in a backyard or area, or any kind of space like that, man, it's tough to do with the layout. And also you count in porches and other things for that lot coverage. It just forces the structure, honestly, up higher out there. So you can put it on there, but it's really going to make redevelopment difficult, just because there's so many other things that aren't shown on there. I guess the last is, you know, we've got great citizens to come out here and talk, but, you know, not everything out there is there's a lot of opinions. There's a lot of, again, fear out there about this, that more people are going to take over the neighborhood and trash is going to be there, and just some of the comments are just so negative. It's unfortunate. The reality is even the house that was built next to one of these sold for more per square foot, $380 a square foot for 1,000 than any other property out there. So it's not a property value thing. It's a neighbors not wanting to buy that piece of property next to them and control it. And there's other options out there. So thank you for the time. Hopefully we can resolve this soon and move on. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hill. Benny Gonzales and Marina Sarmiento on deck.
Benny Gonzales, Gonzales. I live at 3145 Eaton Street, and that's here in the city of Wheat Ridge. Can you hear me okay now? Perfect. All right, thank you. Sorry about that. I do want to speak to the 25-foot height limitation in the R1C zone only. I've lived in the R1C zone since 2012. My wife and I moved here from Thornton picked the city of Wheat Ridge because of the small town atmosphere that it has, the character of the houses. All of them are a little different. We could have moved anywhere in the city. We did look at Denver. We seen what was happening in Denver with a lot of homes being scraped and being building to the maximum height limit there that just did not fit the North Denver area where we looked. So we decided Wheat Ridge. And since we moved here, I've had my very nice view of the mountains taken away. View shed is not there anymore, or it's a big old house in my view shed of the mountains. And it seemed like they just built that to the maximum, took advantage of the height of 35 foot that the city of Wheat Ridge has at the time. So, you know, all I'm saying is let's just get some, all I want is what's equal and fair. And what's equal and fair for a small community should be small houses, not large 35-foot houses. You know, a two-story home would very much fit the neighborhood. It's not like we're trying to say, or I am trying to say, or I want homes to be built a certain way, or any character that they may want to design in their home taken away. Build it any way you want. Use better materials if you don't have to build it so high. It's going to cost you less money. Make it more valuable that way. I don't think any type of home will be value being decreased, the new ones, by limiting the height. And the 15-foot bulk plane still gives you a maximum height limit of 35 feet, which that's one of the reasons we're all here, is to bring it down to 25 foot in the R1C zone only. That's what I'm after, not the whole city. Well, I'm sure you've heard me up here speak a time or two before, and I did want to mention that last year when we did do the bulk plane, there was also a 25-foot height limit on the signatures that we collected door to door, over 100 signatures in a small little area over a small period of time. And that is on the city council, or on record. It's got to be on record. So we should take that into consideration as well. And all the people that are not here that do agree with this 25-foot bulk plane, 25-foot height limitation, such as just on my block alone, I'll be done in here another 10 seconds. I've talked to at least 10 people on my block, just within a 1 block square. And they all agree on the 25-foot height. They just wish they could be here, wanted me to throw that in there on their behalf. At least 10. Thank you. Sorry about. Go.
Thank you, Mr. Gonzales. Marina Sarmiento.
My name is Marina Sarmiento, Sarmiento, 3145 Eaton Street. I agree with most of everybody here about keeping the 25-foot bulk plane in the R1C. I just feel like if people want to rezone or or not rezone, but build new homes, that they should at least consider that we all have small homes and they're taking away our views, and just so they can have a view. So it kind of feels a little invading and unfair. Just wanted to agree with everybody else. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Mr. Michael Epson, and Alvaro Lazalde is on deck.
If I may, Mayor, I'd like to yield my time.
Okay. Okay. Just sign in.
My name is Alvaro Lazalde. The spelling of the last name is Lazalde. I live at 2928 Chase Street. At this time, I'd like to yield my time to Mike.
Thank you.
Thank you.
My name is Michael Epson. I'm a 28-year Wheat Ridge resident in the R1C. The graphics that I've currently handed out show what we would like to have in the way of a 25-foot height limit, including the bulk plane. That's listed on the first page. Just a quick walk through the pictures that we see on the second page. These are homes that have been built within this zone that obviously overshadow the bungalows that are next to them. The bottom two graphics are my neighbor right up the street, Stephanie Hernandez. She spent 10 years cultivating a very private garden. We have some fairly small yards where she could have solitude in her front yard until this house was built right alongside her. You can see the deck at the back of the house directly overlooks where her garden was built. She was so upset by this that she sold the house and she moved out of the city of Wheat Ridge. When she moved, her real estate agent told her that she was probably getting $25,000 to $30,000 less for her house because of its location next to one of these towers. The back 4 sheets on this are signatures that we collected initially when we were doing the bulk plane last year. You'll note that it's a 12.5-foot bulk plane and a 25-foot maximum limit. I've included these 30 signatures because they say 12.5 feet. There's an additional 70 signatures on file with the city that say 15 foot as we modified that and continued to collect petitions last year. The point that I want to make is there's only 740 homes in the R1C. We have over 100 signatures, and that's not because we didn't talk to everyone. That was the amount that we could collect in the short amount of time that we had. What I'm saying is that I have over 100 people standing behind me that believe in this 25-foot height limit. I'd like to thank all of the other speakers. They've touched on privacy and several other issues that involve this. I'd really like for the council to consider a 25-foot maximum height limit just for the R1C. We're only talking about 11% of the city of Wheat Ridge in a very isolated area of small lots and small houses. Please keep Wheat Ridge, Wheat Ridge. We don't want to be Denver. We don't want to be the Highlands. We want to preserve our bungalow neighborhood. It's the affordable part of Wheat Ridge, the most affordable part at this point, and I don't want to lose that neighborhood environment we have. We have a small town feel. We have small lots. We know all of our neighbors. Many of my neighbors are right here today. So to drive home the point, we have 100 people plus in that neighborhood that want a 25-foot maximum building height in the R1C. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Epson. And Peter Peron is our next speaker.
Hello, my name is Peter Peron, P-E-R-R-O-N-E. My business is at 3924 Youngfield, and I own a home at 3085 Chase Street. I'm here to speak about topic number 2, the creation of a marijuana research license. Right now I own a business called Gobi Analytical. We are the only marijuana testing laboratory in Wheat Ridge at the moment. We currently have a license to test retail marijuana and medical marijuana. And right now, basically what we do is quality control testing for the marijuana industry. So I'm a chemist. My co-owner and wife is also a chemist. Basically what we do is to make sure that the products that are being sold in Wheat Ridge and around the state are being sold as they're advertised. They're efficacious. They have in them what they say what's on the label. And we also test for contaminant testing to make sure that the products are safe to consume. So we do E. coli testing, salmonella testing, yeast and mold testing, and things like that. So we test all of the medical and recreational marijuana products. It's a basic quality control like any other product that's meant for human consumption, food products. So we have a full microbiology lab that does food testing for safety, and also we have a full chemistry lab, a full instrumental analysis laboratory that performs quality control the same as what I have performed at over the last 20 years as an analytical chemist for pharmaceutical companies. What we're asking, as many of you might know, the state of Colorado has passed a bill that creates a research license for marijuana. And the first step in us getting that license would be to create that business license here in Wheat Ridge, Colorado. What we would do as an analytical laboratory and a testing laboratory would be to test products, do DNA analysis on plant products, to test the products for potency or and for safety before the research is performed, test the products for contaminants like pesticides, heavy metals, and other contaminants. Many of the studies that have been done in the past, with the very limited research studies done on marijuana, have not performed these quality control tests. So people really don't know if those studies are correct or were done correctly. Right now, we have a lot of cannabis and marijuana being sold in the state, but very little research has actually been done on these products, on the effect they have. There are different cannabinoids, like CBD is one of them. CBD, there's THC, there's CBD. CBD does not get you stoned, but it is the product that people use for epilepsy, that veterans use for PTSD. And these are the studies that we would like to partake in. We would not be doing any kind of, ourselves, any kind of human testing or anything. We would just do the testing of the product before it's consumed and after, right? So we would know that the patient or the subject has consumed this amount and that has been in their system and that it has had an effect on them, and that is what's helping them with the epilepsy or the PTSD. This is a vital component of the entire state's cannabis and marijuana system that we have now, and it's been neglected. So throughout the world, actually. So we have a chance here to be on the forefront of cannabis and marijuana research to make sure that these products are safe and effective and are being consumed in the proper way and for the proper ailments when people do take them as medicine and medical marijuana. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Peron. That concludes all of the people who had signed the sign-in sheet. Is there anyone else in the audience who would like to come and speak? I saw Ms. Yes, ma'am.
Edith Weiss, EDITH WEISS. I live at 3025 Chase Street. And I just wanted to go back to the height restriction. I agree with everything that all of my neighbors said about sunshine and selfishness and privacy. The one other thing that I didn't quite understand what Mr. Hill was talking about, but the one thing that I don't think anybody's brought up is the ones that I've seen leave almost no green, no yard, no land. And they're so gigantic, there's so much there to heat and cool. And for a planet that's warming up, whether or not you believe in climate change, it is happening. I think it's not very forward-thinking or very smart to build so huge and leave so little land for bees and insects, and you can probably tell I'm a gardener. Okay, thank you. Merry Christmas.
Thank you, Ms. Weiss. Anyone else? Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Mayor, council members. Kim Calamino, 4070 Dover Street, and Calamino is spelled C-A-L-O-M-I-N-O. I think as you heard from Mr. Hill, complying with bulk playing is a very complicated matter, and I think it's not well understood by builders or residents in the community. I think you've also heard from a very select group, not necessarily folks that were widely informed in District 1 of what this issue might mean to them. As you think about height restrictions, Wheat Ridge is one of 2 cities in the entire state of Colorado that already has a height limitation in its charter. That's unique. It limits things from an affordable housing perspective, which is something we struggle with here in Wheat Ridge, as does the entire state. I don't think there's any advantage to further limiting our height restrictions. But mostly I want to say to you, this is a complicated issue. I don't think that you can isolate, beginning with bulk playing and then with height limitations and whatever is next, in a piecemeal manner, address the kinds of zoning issues that might inform us as we look forward to what kind of community we want, what kind of homeowners we want to welcome, what we want our community to look like. We've also been discussing ADUs, accessory dwelling units, and we have not concluded that discussion. If you proceed with height limitations in one zone or all zones, you will be limiting the opportunity for carriage houses over garage ADUs. This is not a piecemeal discussion. This is something to be undertaken in a complete overview as you look at zoning. You know, I believe you're all going to be looking at the NRS, the Neighborhood Revitalization Strategy, and the comp plan going forward. Those are the places where you should be considering these discussions. They're complex, they're interactive, they're not isolated in their impact, and I would encourage you to take a deliberate and studied approach to all of these issues and not act hastily. And I just want to say, I think research on marijuana is a really important thing. We've been restricted in those avenues, and we should know what's in those products, and I would encourage you to consider allowing that to happen in Wheat Ridge. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Calomino. Is there anyone else in our audience who hasn't spoken who would like to speak at this time? I don't see any other hands, so we'll close the public comments section. And we're ready to move on to item number 1, residential height limitations in R1C. Mr. Goff, do we have a presentation?
Yes, Mr. Johnstone.
Okay, Mr. Johnstone is going to give us a presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Well, obviously everyone I think in the room knows that residential building heights and the related topic of residential bulk plane have been topics of discussion for staff, city council, the planning commission, and obviously many, many citizens over the past year or so. As I've mentioned many times, early in 2016, or 2017, excuse me, we started looking into the topic, knowing that we were getting some feedback from citizens with some of the larger infill development that was occurring in East Wheat Ridge, and wanted to kind of benchmark ourselves against other communities relative to these two concepts, building heights and bulk plane. And I won't belabor that point. I think all on council know of kind of what that process and evolution has looked like over the course of that period of time. Ultimately, residential bulk plane regulations were adopted a little over a year ago. I think it was November 17th of 2016. And they've proven, I think, to be at least an effective tool in my mind, in that they do what was intended. Obviously, we're still discussing whether that's sufficient in people's minds, but they do effectively give bigger setbacks from perimeter property lines for 2- and 3-story construction. And we've shown you some of those graphics and included some of those graphics in the council memo and attachments, but essentially in a nutshell, for kind of typical, and there's no way to absolutely define that, but 2-story construction, the effective setbacks become about 8 feet, and for a full 3-story construction, the effective setbacks become about 10 to 13 feet. So those are the practical impacts. But that said, there's still, obviously, from the people that you're hearing from this evening, interest in further limiting, I'll just say, the scale of residential development, and perhaps particularly in East Wheat Ridge. And one way of doing that would be, of course, to further limit the maximum building height from 35 feet. 35 feet is what's been in place really citywide in all residential zone districts since the city was incorporated in 1969. But it's certainly a legitimate discussion to discuss whether that's appropriate to consider amending. Most recently, in terms of the history with council, on October 23rd, you directed staff to develop a web-based survey tool on the topic of bulk plane and residential building heights. City council provided initial direction in drafting some of those questions, and then city staff kind of fine-tuned that a little bit and got a survey out kind of very quickly. It was not intended to be a scientific tool, and we needed to get it out quickly, and it was live through the city's website from November 3rd to November 19th. And immediately after we closed that survey at midnight on the 19th, we got in front of council on Monday the 20th with those preliminary results. And I won't belabor that, though I'll I can talk a little bit about a few of the highlights. We did include in your council memo the 3 questions that were related directly to building height and the number of stories that were asked in that survey. The direction that you provided at the November 20th meeting was threefold. As has been noted tonight, an update of the NRS is a high council policy priority for 2018. We're beginning to work on what that looks like at a staff level. There was also direction to include in the 2018 biannual citizen survey additional questions on height, bulk plane, as well as ADUs and short-term rentals. So all those things came out of your direction from November 20th. And then finally, you asked us to keep looking at this topic of further limitations, notably 25 feet on residential building height in the R1C zone district, which is what we're here to speak with you tonight. I think Zach Wallace, who's sitting in the back, and Lauren Mikulak, we wanted to get this in front of you quickly and keep the momentum that we have in terms of the discussion. As a practical matter, it's also hard to get on study session agendas in January and February because there's some federal holidays that can tend to get in the way. So we're glad to be in front of you tonight to just keep the discussion active. The principal purpose of the staff memo in this case was really to describe the actual impact of taking an action like making a further limitation such as 25 feet on residential building height in the R1C zone district. I think we've explained before that there's a lot of lots in R1C that are 50 feet wide, 125 feet deep, so that's a very typical scenario. Just how the platting occurred back at the turn of the century, that's a very common lot size, but there's certainly bigger lots and smaller lots, as has been noted tonight as well. So there were a few figures in the council memo. Figure 1 really just lays out what's some typical construction parameters in terms of what is dimensions floor to ceiling, what is dimensions structurally between floors, what's a typical distance that the first floor is above grade. They're all assumptions, they're all variable, but the intent was to really look at a typical 2-story home and really in our minds see whether that would be impacted by further limiting the building height to 25 feet. So figure 2 really shows the impact of applying both the bulk plane and possibly further limiting maximum building height. And if you look at the right side of figure 2, I don't have it in front of me but I do now. We measure building height to the midpoint between peak of roof and the edge of eave or bottom of eave. So you can see by that line being a little bit below what if you can visualize where that midpoint would be, it appears to us that the additional impact of going with a 25-foot building height, again with the assumptions that we've used, which are not perfect, but we think are fairly good, that could have an impact, likely would have a slight impact on the ability to build a 2-story home. So that's something to just be aware of moving forward. That's what our analysis tells us. We also, as I mentioned, included a few responses from the citizen survey in the memo just for reference. Again, acknowledging that's not scientific, but it's certainly a data point that we have to look at. So in terms of further restrictions on residential building height, there was, I guess, limited support for that. I think more respondents than not did not support. So more people did not support further restrictions on residential building height, but it was definitely a mixed response. On the limitations on the permissibility of 2-story homes, there was pretty clear direction and consensus on that, with 84% of respondents not supporting, just flat out not allowing 2-story construction. As it pertains to 3-story construction, the results were much more mixed. 42% did support further limitations, but on the flip side, 38% did not support. So that really a little more supporting limitations on 3-story construction, but not by much. We did include some data just for reference, since for now the discussion is mostly pertaining to properties in the R1C zone district and District 1. We did show those data points as well, just for reference and comparison. A few other resources, I guess, just to kind of set the stage for this discussion today. We did provide 2 zoning maps. Map 1 depicts just the R1C properties in the city, and then map 2 is a zoning map of the entire city. Obviously, there are many, many other residential zoning districts, as that is the majority land use in the city. And then finally, in terms of references, attachment, I think it was attachment 3, shows that typical R1C lot, and I already mentioned kind of those typical numbers, 50 by 125, and the practical impact of the bulk plane that's been adopted at 15 feet again is typically 8 feet is the effective setback for 2-story structures from the side property lines and the rear property lines, and 13 feet is the effective impact of the bulk plane requirement on 3-story construction. We've given you 2 options. I'm sure there's probably many more. Just to back up, so those graphics really, I think that attachment 3 really helps to just kind of show you what the practical impact is in terms of the net buildable area for each of those 3 different scenarios. So hopefully that's helpful information. We have suggested, obviously, council has the ability to amend R1C zoning to change or modify that building height. If there's a desire to allow 2-story construction, 25 feet might not be quite the right number. I think we'd want to do some additional research on that and get you a better number. But that's certainly an option to amend through an ordinance the R1C zoning. That, from a process standpoint, the minimum threshold is that has to be done after conducting a public hearing before the Planning Commission, and of course a public hearing on the ordinance before City Council. And another approach that could be considered is what's called a zoning overlay. Zoning overlays are used when you want to change the regulations for a certain geographic area. So you could leave R1C zoning alone because it does apply citywide, but create an overlay map that basically could say for some defined geographic area, this rule or these rules are slightly different, such as a lower building height or some other requirement for a geographic portion of the city, not all R1C zone properties. That's what I have for you this evening. I'm glad to take questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Johnstone. We're going to open this up to council for questions. Mr. Duran, you brought this forward. Would you like to go first or move to another? You brought this forward. You can go first if you'd like. Otherwise, we will open it up to the rest of council. Very good. So this is an open discussion. Do we have anyone that would like to speak on this issue? Mr. Matthews.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I know the people that are in this room right now are specifically interested in the R1C zones. One of the reasons I supported bringing this back into council's attention zone was because last year when we were looking at this, we asked for moratorium so that we could address these issues citywide, and that would coincide a little bit with what Ms. Calamina was talking about, that we didn't want to just patchwork some zoning changes without looking at effects across the whole city. And I'm greatly in favor of that. A bulk plane, if we were to, let's just suppose we were to adopt a 15-foot bulk plane across the city, it would look significantly different in some of the other zoning districts where the lots are maybe 100, 120 feet wide as compared to R13, and we need to be able to visualize and have some conception of what that would look like. I think we have to get back to a little bit to, we hear the fight between, and I'm just trying to kind of get people's thoughts going here, between, neighbors' rights versus property owners' rights, and we fight that battle on a daily basis, or at least a weekly basis up, here in the council chambers. We probably need to go back and look at, do our entire zoning codes and the way that we've drafted them in the past fit the needs of the city in order to maintain order? Because when you get down to the bottom line, the reason we have zoning codes is to maintain order within the community, so that you don't have a grain elevator here, a bungalow here, a 7-Eleven here, and what have you. We do a lot of regulating of private property in order to make sure that whatever's built on a piece of property is consistent with its surroundings. And I think that's what the folks are asking for here, is they want to have some relief to make sure that whatever we do, that we don't just look at the individual property, but we continue to maintain the concept of what is consistent with the total surroundings of the private property. And then we have to figure out how to cut the baby in half. How do we take care of the private property owners' property rights, but also the neighborhood rights? Because people buy into a neighborhood and they have expectations that that's probably going to look same, more or less the same. Someone may paint a house, may add a room somewhere, depending, but it's going to be the same neighborhood forever because they were looking to put down roots. Oh crap, I just lost my train of thought too. I'll get back to you. I won't hem and haw you. I've got another point, but it disappeared.
Thank you, Mr. Matthews. Mr. Fitzgerald.
I'd like to support Larry in one aspect. I have actually about 4 reasons why I would not vote to move this forward. But one is because we're going to start looking at the neighborhood revitalization study. I've been looking at it to familiarize myself with it. It's a big study. I invite people to look at it. I'm making, by the way, a Cliff Notes version for anybody who's interested. But the 2005 study, the last one we have, talks extensively about the houses in District 1 in the area that we are currently referring to, the R1C zoning area primarily, and speaks to what that means for the future of Wheat Ridge. And I urge my colleagues here to look at that part of the neighborhood revitalization study to see what it says about that. It is my hope that what we can do here is actually what Kim was talking about and what Larry was talking about, and that is that we can redo the neighborhood revitalization study, then we can align our goals to that study so that we're sort of moving down the same pathway. And the third step would be, if we have a retreat, to finalize those goals and make sure they're correlated in the way we want them to be to the neighborhood revitalization study. So that's sort of reason number one, is it would be contrary to what the 2005 revitalization study suggests that we do in the housing in District 1. The second reason is that, as we know from the poll that we did online, even people in District 1 do not support restricting the 25-foot, restricting to 25 feet. And that's true citywide. So if we want to do what citizens want, if we want to follow the lead of the citizens, we have to not move this forward. The third reason would be, this is something we've already dealt with fairly recently. And I really don't like the habit we're getting into of restudying something that we've recently studied and putting aside other things that would be helpful to moving the city forward. And we've spent a lot of time recently on redoing what we've already done. So I would hope that what we could do is leave any consideration of twiddling with the bulk plane and ADUs and temporary rentals to after we've had some familiarity with the neighborhood revitalization strategy, because that study really talks to those issues. And I would like to be comprehensive in the way we go forward with this. So I cannot vote to move forward with this.
Thank you, Mr. Fitzgerald. Ms. Davis.
Well, since we'll just go down the line, I'll actually mirror what Mr. Matthews and Mr. Fitzgerald has said, as far as I do think that this is something that we need to look at. I do think it's something, as Ms. Calomino has said, that it's something that we need to look at more globally. And actually, my fellow council folks have said that too in their comments. In that, I don't think we should just limit it. Our zoning law already looks like a patchwork quilt, and then all of a sudden we're going to patchwork it more with different bulk planes in each zone. So I would like to have us look at it from that perspective, that we look at how else it might impact from a global perspective in other zones, and is there more that we should be doing in different zones as well. I would also mirror that this is something that we actually, the bulk plane became effective November 21st of 2016. And again, I've had several people from this district call me and say, hey, these were the rules then, and I have put $10,000 into plans and done what you've asked me to do, and now you're going to change it again on me before I've come for final approval through the city. So I do think that we're kind of doing a little bit of a bait switch with those folks that listened to what we said in 2016. They're now following the rules, and now 1 year later we're changing them again. So I think we need to be mindful of that. And then the other thing, I just have, so I do think it's something we need to be addressed. I think it needs to be a part of the study. I think it needs to be addressed along with the ADU situation, because there are folks with larger lots that maybe they do want to put a mother-in-law suite on their roof, or on the roof of their garage that's behind their property, and how is that going to impact them? So I do think it needs to be bigger. So that's my thought on that. And I have just a quick question on the pictures that Mr. Epson presented. So this photo here is, what I'm guessing is, this was before the bulk plane. So is that true? So it's my understanding that the way this is built here is not the way it could be built now because of some of the bulk plane regulations we put in place?
Pretty sure that's the case, yeah. I visually can't just absolutely with certainty say that, but I'm pretty sure.
But from what I remember, it's got to be, it can't be straight up. It's kind of more.
It can be, but that structure would have to be about 13 feet off of the interior side property line to be that tall.
Okay.
That structure was designed and constructed before the bulk plane ordinance went into place.
Right, and it would look a little different today because of the bulk plane.
Sure. Yes.
Okay.
Thank you, Ms. Davis. Ms. Dozman.
I was just wanting some clarification as to where this home is located in the picture.
One at the top is on Fenton Street, the one on the bottom is on Chase Street.
Fenton and Chase, okay, thank you.
Look, I tell you what, if we're gonna speak, please, we'll move you to the microphone. But right now we're not taking public comments. So just.
I just wanted to know the address.
Okay.
The location. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Hoppy.
Thank you. First, I want to say thank you to everybody who's come to all of these meetings as residents and have spoken to us. I also want to say thank you to all the ones who have called and emailed and called some more, and about this conversation that we're having. Now, this is the 7th time that we're having this conversation between City Council study sessions, business sessions, and the Planning Commission. So it is definitely not being brushed under the rug, is what I'd like to mention. I'd also like to say that I think that the 15-foot bulk plane is effective, and I do think it was a well-thought-out solution. And some of the things that we have that we're looking here, based on these standards, a total height of 32 feet at the peak is common for a 2-story residential construction. So a 25-foot is effectively giving us a single-story home. I don't think that that's prudent if we want people to be able to grow in their homes in our community. And I can give you a very personal example. I lived down in Denver in one of those small lots, and for us, once we had our 3rd child, we had no more room. And a lot of those homes have like kind of a dirt floor, half dug out basement, so going down wasn't really an option. And so what we ended up doing is we didn't necessarily pop the top, but we finished the attic to get another room. So if we wanted to pop the top, though, under these restrictions, we wouldn't have been able to. Now, we did finish the attic, and we stayed there for quite a while, but then the fact that my children couldn't ride their bike on the street or down the sidewalk had us move into another neighborhood who now has no sidewalks, but that's a whole nother story. So that's a kind of a personal thing that I wanted to mention, is that people do try to grow in their home. And I can also tell you that working in the construction industry for a long time, we've seen more and more people growing in their homes rather than moving and buying tract homes. But if they can't grow in their homes and they can't get what they want in their homes, then they do end up leaving. So we do end up losing our residents. Another thing that I would like to mention is, first I want to ask for clarification on attachment 3. Mr. Johnstone, on the 3-story with bulk plane, it's got a 14-foot side setback, and the total buildable area is 2,002 square feet. Now, my guess is that's per level. Mm-hmm. So if we were, the availability to build 3 levels straight up would only happen up to 35 feet if there was 14 feet side setbacks on both sides, 14 in the rear and 20 on the side, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Which makes it then a 22-foot by 91-foot building to go straight up. So the narrative of the 3-story homes are going to be right on my property line and are going straight up is not anymore with the bulk plane. The bulk plane has destroyed that. And here's another thing. If the buildable area is only 2,002 square feet by 3 levels, then your total square footage is 4,004 square feet. You can get 4,000 square feet with a single level home. So you basically you're not getting any more square footage to build up 3 stories. So that is not, that's just not sensible, it seems to me. Like, that's not very sensible.
And
so,
if I may, just one caveat to that, because we couldn't communicate kind of everything in these graphics, but the one asterisk that would apply to the first 2 scenarios, and not the long skinny one, but the 1-story and the 2-story, there is also a maximum lot coverage. So that's really the buildable area where you can put stuff, but it would also be further limited to 40%, Zach? Yeah, 40% in R1C is the maximum lot coverage. So you'd be at about 2,400 square feet on those lots for first floor lot coverage.
And then another thing that I would like to mention is that when we did put in the bulk plane, we reduced the building, the available building area by 25%. And if we reduce it to a height limitation of 25 feet, then we reduce the buildable area by another 40, but by 40% total. I don't feel like that it's prudent to add a 25-foot limitation and basically saying that only 1-story homes are what we think is what what everybody would want in our community. And because of that, I can't support the 25 feet. I have already said that the height of 35 feet being in our city charter should be something that we should look at. I think our city charter in general is something we should look at. And absolutely, we did get caught with our pants down when the developers were coming in and going straight up 35 feet. Yes, that was something that was in our city charter. What else do we have in there that we are not necessarily paying attention to that could end up coming back to bite us? I don't know. So I would support that we have a citizens commission to review the city charter, to look at things like that, and to come to city council with suggestions. All of those things would have to be voted on by the people. I also support continuing the conversation with the ADUs and with the NRS, and I do think that they should be intertwined somehow. But I do want to lay out fair warning. Our staff, we can't keep filling their plates without something falling off of it. And so we just have to make sure that we are, we're prioritizing these conversations in a way that we can effectively still get work done and not have them running in circles, chasing their tails all the time.
Thank you, Ms. Hoppe. Other discussion in the council? Okay, well, Mr. Matthews, if your train is coming in, let's get it unloaded.
Thank you. Yeah, I was trying to let everyone else speak and not barge in right away. One of the things I think that we need to consider as we move forward is how did we get here? And we were incorporated in the late 60s. A lot of these houses were built in the late 40s and 50s and early 60s. And so when we incorporated, we inherited whatever happened in unincorporated Jefferson County. And I think our forefathers who were helping us to find our identity at the time did a pretty nice job. But you have to realize that when they drove around the city, a lot of these houses already existed. And so they just try to do a one-size-fits-all by saying a maximum of 35 feet. And I don't believe any of them envisioned that someone would build 35 feet in the residential neighborhoods, because most of them were already built out to some extent, or at least in due process. And at the time, ranch homes, I mean, that was kind of the norm. So they didn't envision that someone would take down these small homes and try to go 35 feet in the air. They tried to come up, I believe, with one-size-fits-all that would fit our commercial zones also. And ergo, we came up with a maximum building height of 35 feet that included our commercial zones. And I don't think they envisioned the pickle that we're in right now with the changing in demographics and times. We did kind of not consider this quickly enough. But, you know, we kind of inherited the situation too, so I don't think we should feel too badly. But that's kind of the point I was trying to make, is that 35 foot wasn't just directed at residential homes. They gave us a maximum for the whole city, all zones, and that was a compromise, I assume, at the time to allow some larger, like Walmarts, to take place, so you could have more than just a one-story commercial building. And hope we consider that as we move forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Ann?
Thank you. Thank you to everyone that came in to speak tonight. I know you have come in several times. My thoughts are, we did ask for this discussion to take place back in, gosh, I think it was June or July of 2016, to have a thorough discussion so that we wouldn't have to be having it again today. So I don't feel it's a bait and switch and we're trying to tell folks who have put $10,000 down, sorry, but we're gonna change things up. We just didn't have the right discussion at the time. We should have had it. I'm in support of having a 25-foot height restriction in the R1C. I don't know if any of you have driven over in that neighborhood, but driving over there and living there are two different things. I'm totally open to discussing our NRA moving forward in 2018, talking about ADUs, Airbnbs, but as we're having those discussions, these in this neighborhood can be changed dramatically. That's what my concern is not being mindful and thoughtful of all the folks that live there now and have made this home for 30, 40, 50 years. So, you know, to sit here and say that we've had this discussion 7 times, what's the limit on how many times they have this discussion to get it done right? We're talking about 11% of Wheat Ridge. It's 740 homes that are unique and special to the area. To lose that because we want to delay the discussion, we're concerned about other developers who are coming in, and because we want to make sure that we do this properly and we don't piecemeal it, I agree with you. I don't want to piecemeal it either. But at the same time, I don't want this neighborhood, for all of these citizens, just look at their faces. Look at the 100 signatures that we have here, and they could have had more. To look at them, they'll be moving out of these neighborhoods. So as we're worried about new people not moving here, all of the existing neighbors that have lived here all these years are going to be moving out of this neighborhood. And that's what I would really hate to see. So I would love to ask for a consensus, unless anyone else has any more comments.
We're a little early for consensus, I think.
Pardon?
Let's make sure that everyone has an opportunity to weigh in
That's
before
what
we
I
go
was
to
concerned
consensus.
about. So I'm in support of this. I've given you the reasons why several times. You probably know them all by heart. And let me make it clear, I do want to discuss Airbnbs. I do want to discuss ADUs. I want to have those conversations. I want to do them right and properly. But I also do not want to put this neighborhood on hold over 6 months, 9 months, or a year while we're having those discussions, because it will change it dramatically.
Thank you, Ms. Duran. Ms. Dozman.
So just as the newcomer, from the outside perspective coming in, I feel like the bulk plane was a good compromise for this conversation, and it has restricted building codes and pretty dramatically, I feel, in this neighborhood. I know that we're trying to conserve the character of Wheat Ridge, and I really appreciate everyone coming out and speaking to that matter. I know that this issue is very important to you, but in my mind, I feel like this piecemealing this together is kind of us creating a situation where we're requiring residents to enter into an HOA without them having actually contracted and agreed to that. It's us, the government, dictating and placing regulations upon them after the fact. And really, and I know that this comes down to neighbors' rights versus individual property rights, but I really don't feel like restricting the height limitations to 25 feet when we already restricted at 35 feet and have had this discussion and created additional bulk plane restrictions as fair to people who do have dreams in this home or in this community. I would like to grow in this community with my family. I know that a lot of my friends would like to grow in this community and have done so. And if we impose these restrictions on them, they would be unable to do that. And I know we're just talking about one district at this point in time, or one zoning area at this point in time, but at what point in time are we going to say enough is enough?
Thank you, Ms. Dozman. Additional comments from council. Mr. Urban.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. You know, I think that it's important to understand, going back to the NRS, when you look at the NRS, it specifically puts kind of a fine point on this, in that it says Wheat Ridge is going to have to decide who their new customer is going to be, precisely who is the typical Wheat Ridge resident. And so that's kind of where I think the rubber meets the road here is, do we care about the existing residents who have voiced their concerns about these issues, or are we seeking a new customer and wanting to sell homes to people moving into Wheat Ridge, and what is that new housing stock going to look like for new residents? And so for me, I think that we do need to develop some type of compromise here, and I think that the bulk plane regulations that we put in place do provide some of that appropriate restrictions in the R1C neighborhood. But given the fact that it is such a small area within the city, it does seem reasonable that there would be some type of compromise available, you know, whether it be within that overlay district or the overlay regulation that would, you know, provide some sort of height limitation. But I'm just concerned about when we talk about the NRS and we talk about why we're doing what we're doing, it's that by not imposing some of these restrictions, we're specifically seeking new customers. We're specifically pushing out current residents, and that to me is not acceptable, and I think we need to come up with some kind of compromise here that would allow us to be amenable and neighborly to our existing residents while still being welcoming to new residents. But I don't want to be looking to entice new residents to move in at the expense of existing residents. So I would be in favor of an overlay district or some other type of compromise here that would give us, especially in such a limited area as the R1C district is, that would give us that ability. But I think that the 35-foot height limitation is appropriate across the majority of the city, and as we can see in a variety of different zone districts, 35 feet is wholly appropriate. But there are, as it relates to, you try to put a 3-story new build property right next door to a 1-story ranch, that begins to be somewhat onerous on that neighbor that has the 1-story ranch. So I think we need to be mindful that we're reaching out for new residents at the expense of existing residents.
Thank you, Mr. Urban. Ms. Hoppy?
I have to disagree that it's not one or the other. And I would also like to say that there are several people who have emailed me and called me who live in R1C in Wheat Ridge currently and do not want and do not support the 25-foot height limitation. And so to say that to not support a 25-foot height limitation means that we're not supporting the current residents, we're only supporting the new residents that we want to move here, is not true. That's a broad stroke painting. I'd also like to point out that in the survey results, for single-family homes and duplexes, should the city prohibit the construction of 2-story homes? 196 people of 233 that took it said no. When it said, to what extent do you support the city lowering the maximum height limitation to make it more strict? Your choices were strongly support, support, neutral, don't support, strongly don't support. If you add support and don't support together and kick the neutral out of it, you have 78 who strongly support and 116 who don't support. So, this is not a matter of pitting one neighbor against another. And I do think that the bulk plane was a good compromise. And so for that, again, I cannot support the 25 feet.
Thank you, Ms. Hoppy. Ms. Duran?
This wasn't a scientific survey, and like Ken Johnstone said, this was put together rather quickly, so to put all our bases on a decision over this survey, I don't think is fair. Secondly, there's 100 signatures in here of people who live in R1C that supported the 25-foot height restriction. And Ken, for the sake of the audience and people watching, can you explain the overlay regulation and how that would work for them? Of the second option that's here?
Yeah, so a zoning overlay is just another way to do this. We don't have any true zoning overlays in place. We've talked about maybe doing one up in the area around our TOD to really carve out some specific requirements that would encourage, kind of typical transit-oriented development aspects. You could do one for, if you wanted to define, say, an architectural character area. That's probably the most common reason. I don't know if someone like Breckenridge has an overlay per se, but if you have kind of a defined historic character district and you want to ensure that everything has a certain percentage of siding or certain pitch of roofs or something like that, you could do an overlay that would lay out those special rules. I know when I worked in Louisville, we had an overlay in our downtown, both in the commercial and in the residential, that achieve different things. But that's the approach, is just you have a specific regulation that applies to a geographic area. So if there's a defined geographic area where council thinks that the building height would be most appropriately restricted, you could just do that. So it wouldn't apply to the R1C properties, say on the other side of town.
So it would just apply to the R1Cs on the eastern?
Whatever geographic
or whatever
area.
We decide.
It just, you draw a map and embed it in your zoning code and say, for these areas, look at R1C, but also the height is further restricted to
And could they still apply for a variance?
Yes.
Okay. Yep. And the process, if you could just explain that for the citizens. I know what it is, but.
Yeah. So variances can be applied for. We have somewhat of a unique situation in Wheat Ridge in that we have a fairly high allowance for administrative variances. So for any given development standard, so if you have a minimum setback, or I guess the issue at hand is height, so you have height, you can apply for a variance from the maximum height's kind of a little tricky just because we also have charter restrictions that say you can't get a variance to something that's in the charter. It's only something that's in the development code. The most typical variances that we look at pertain to setbacks. So if you have let's say a 15-foot minimum rear yard setback and you want to add on to the back of your house or maybe build a detached garage that's off an alley, you can request a variance for up to 50% of that development standard. So in this case, if the standard is 15 feet, you can apply for a variance for up to 7.5 feet. There's a series of 9 different criteria that we review those applications against. So an applicant would submit an application for a variance. We do what we call courtesy variances if they want to get initial staff input as to what they think their likelihood of getting our support would be, because we need to find that a majority of those 9 criteria are met in order to support the request. If we don't support the request at a staff level, or if there's a neighborhood objection, there's a public noticing period, and if we get a written objection in that public noticing period, ultimately I don't think that the variance criteria have been met, then a Board of Adjustment hearing is held. And for all variances that are more than 50% of the standard, it goes automatically to the Board of Adjustment. And it's kind of tricky how to explain what a bulk plan variance is, but we have created a graphic for how we calculate a 50% variance. So if people are curious what that looks like, we can show people that graphic that depicts what a 50% threshold variance looks like as it pertains to bulk plan.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank
Johnstone.
Thank you.
Additional questions, comments from council? Okay, I believe we're ready for consensus. There's consensus out there. Mr. Ann?
Yes. I think this would be a good compromise if we could limit 1 to 2 family construction height in a specific geographic area, regardless of zoning, by establishing an overlay regulation. So I'd like to get a consensus on that, please. Limit 1 and 2 family construction height in a specific geographic area, regardless of zoning, by establishing an overlay regulation.
Is there a consensus among council for that?
Was there a limit?
1 or 2. 1 to 2. Limit 1 and 2 family.
Story to
Construction height.
to
Yes.
25 feet. Is it? You didn't give
I need a number in there.
Yeah.
Yes, 25 foot height. Yes, make it clear.
Okay, so
You
this is
said that was for new construction only?
No.
No, okay.
So this would create an overlay district somewhere in the city of Wheat Ridge for all houses to be, or a certain zone district, regardless of the current zoning, but in some geographical location, limited to 25 feet. Is there consensus among council to do this? Yes, sir?
Would it be appropriate right now to just ask for a little bit of fleshing out on the consensus itself before we go to a vote? Just so we kind of have a feel for how are these areas going to be decided. I'm not sure. In general, I'm in favor of this, but I don't know if at this point in time we can sit here and say, well, it's going to be for the southeast corner of the southeast corner of the fourth of section 26.
Right.
We have to try and at some point in time, staff is going to have to help us out here and giving us some recommendations.
Well, I would,
work.
sort of give you my answer on that. I would think that we would want to see whether this is a road that we want to go down, and then we would flush out the details on that road.
As long as we have that understanding that there's...
Yeah, so is there a consensus to create an overlay district that would ultimately restrict geographically the height of houses to residential properties to 25 feet? I don't see a consensus for that. Ms. Hoppy?
I'd like to ask for a consensus to table the topic of 25-foot height max in any district.
All right, this would be to table.
To table the conversations of it. A consensus to table it.
Well, this would be a consensus not to move forward, or something.
I'd like to ask for a consensus to not move forward on the topic of 25 feet height max in any district.
Is there? There does appear to be a consensus for that. So I believe that would, does that give you the direction that you were looking for?
It does, sir.
Okay. Okay, then I believe that we've concluded item number 1. All right, let us move on to item number 2. Item number 2 is marijuana research and development licenses, and if Ms. Berry would join us at the study session table. This is item number 2. We have with us today Carmen Berry with Mr. Dahl's law firm. And Ms. Berry, would you give us an introduction on this item?
Sure, thank you, Mr. Mayor and members of council. Pleased to be here again. Jerry doesn't share you with me too often, so I'm always happy when he does. As Mayor Starker mentioned, I work with Jerry Dahl in your city attorney's office. And you have, council, a memo from us concerning what might be surprisingly a less lively topic than zoning, which is marijuana. And specifically research and development licenses. As my very brief memo with the accompanying House bill from the last legislative session very briefly explain, this last session in 2017, the state legislature created yet another new type of marijuana business enterprise related license, this one called a marijuana research and development license, and the associated research and development cultivation license. As my memo outlines again very briefly, those new licenses are brand new types of marijuana type enterprises that the state has created and authorized. As their names suggest, the research and development license authorizes the license holder to conduct research and development activities. And the associated cultivation licenses authorize those license holders to cultivate marijuana strictly for those associated research purposes, not to cultivate for retail sale or any other use than the associated R&D research uses. There are, as you may know, already also existing and authorized by the state testing facilities. And as you heard in public comment this evening, there is at least one testing facility already located in the city of Wheat Ridge. What's the difference? I think that's sort of the first question that I had when the state legislature authorized research and development. Well, we already have testing facilities, so why the need for this new kind of animal? And in my read of both the law and the regs that have been promulgated to effectuate those laws, as you again heard from public comment, the already existing testing facilities that have been in place for some time perform sort of as QC or quality control for marijuana and products that are given to them to test. So how much THC is in here, what's the potency, are there pesticides or contaminants in this product that we're sending to you to test for us for purity. This new type of license, which again is research and development rather than primarily testing, is more, as best I understand it, about researching and developing new products, conducting clinical trials. That's a new kind of activity that would be authorized for these licensees. As mentioned again in public comment, both testing and clinical trials on animals and human beings are potentially authorized under these research and development licenses. So it is more this new kind of license about the development of new product rather than quality control for existing product that's given then to the testing lab just to test it, again, for things like potency and purity. So as an initial matter, Council, what we as staff would like from you is your consensus on whether or not you even wish to investigate allowing these kinds of new licenses and new business types to locate in the city of Wheat Ridge. To state it very simply, those kinds of licenses that aren't explicitly authorized by the city's code and authorized both in, at least addressed in zoning as to where they can locate, and in our licensing provisions of the code, as expressly authorized there. Those that aren't expressly addressed are, in fact, then de facto prohibited. So should someone like Gobi, Mr. Peron, want to add these kinds of activities or licenses to their existing locations or even have a new location, if we got that inquiry as staff, we would say that's not currently permitted. Because there has been some interest that we have heard as staff in authorizing these kinds of facilities, that's why we bring this threshold question to you. Would you like us as staff to bring you some regulatory and licensing options? Because we think that's the first step for you to consider.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Berry. Mr. Pond, I saw your hand go up.
Excuse me, thank you for the public comment earlier, and thank you for the report. I have been thinking about it for a little while. I just want to chime in and say that I absolutely support our ability to solve this problem as it relates to being able to bring research into the regulatory framework that we've created for the rest of the marijuana industry. And I know we've spent a lot of time doing that internally as a staff, as a council, as a community, and so it's really important. And I think through that process we've learned that a lot of the concern and care was about getting down to real metrics about these things, not only how it affects our community, but in this case the ability to support and be leaders in the research as well. So I think I just want to let you know that I certainly support that. As I think about this, I think the easiest thing to support, just to put it out there, is that if we already have a regulatory framework that talks about in some ways what these things are from a procedural standpoint and what we're allowing for them in a code, and I'll go back to like saying laboratory testing function, to the extent that there is a research component of that actually adheres to those same principles. There's not going to be public access. There's a certain chain of custody protocol for materials coming in and out, et cetera. To the extent that those procedural things tie very similarly or exactly to the laboratory testing functions that we already have put into our community, then I think we ought to be willing to support the addition of research or research testing in that case. I do think that this is a nascent topic and there's a lot of things to kind of understand in here. So to the extent that quote research would expand beyond things that we've already had a very healthy discussion about and codified, then I think that we obviously need more information. But as it relates to, for instance, this lab that's been a part of our community and a growing business and utilizing the work that we've put into this regulatory framework, and now asking to have research be another component part of what they're doing, because they're situated that they can and that they don't think. And I agree that it wouldn't be a bad effect to what we've already done. I support that.
Thank you, Mr. Pond. Ms. Davis.
I want to thank you for the clarification on, because I was like, wait a minute, we already have something like this. So thank you for that clarification between testing and this new license. Or I think coming from a field that does institutional review board types of IRB, drug testing, healthcare testing, I do think it's something we should support looking into. But that's also a very highly, especially, with like drug testings and protocols, highly regulated area that we see by the FDA and things like that. So I would really want to get more clarification, especially when it comes to an institutional review board, because that's some pretty serious, at least from what I know of and what I've seen, some pretty serious stuff as far as when you start testing these things and we have individuals involved and releases and outcomes and all that need to be tracked and tested and approved. So I would support looking further into that, but I also am very familiar with the IRB world in healthcare, and would just like to see how that's going to be regulated in this area.
Thank you, Ms. Davis. Ms. Hoppy.
I just want to say that I also support bringing forward regulation and licensing options for us to review. I do think that it's important for the testing and the research to happen. Clinical trials is kind of where I'm like, so I think that when we start looking at regulation and licensing options, I just would like to make sure that there's some piece in there where if there are clinical trials on humans, which I read through the act and it says there can be, that we have some sort of, I guess, boundaries around with zoning of where these places can be, and like different maybe safety protocol for that.
Thank you. I think Mr. Rand got my eye first.
Oh, great, thank you. I do support what we're trying to do here. I do have a lot of questions, you know, not just location, but how many licenses, and just a little bit more about the protocol and how it works. So I would like to get that information brought to us so that we can really kind of make a good educated decision on this. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Matthews.
Thank you. I'm kind of hung up on this right now, but I'd like, what I have some questions over is R&D is kind of a vague description. Are we looking at how to make marijuana 20% more potent per gram or ounce or whatever they sell it by, versus are we looking to see how it might affect lymphoma or some kind of cancer? I mean, I don't think we need more varieties of marijuana brownies or need to support that kind of R&D. So is there anything in the act that already kind of limits or describes what's a legitimate R&D effort?
I would, on page 3 of the bill that was provided to us, on section 2, A through E, indicates what those research purposes would be, and just to enumerate those: A is to test chemical potency and composition levels; B, to conduct clinical investigation of marijuana-deprived medicinal products; C is to conduct research on the efficacy and safety of administering marijuana as part of a medical treatment; D is to conduct genomic, horticultural, or agricultural research; and E is to conduct research on marijuana-affiliated products or systems. So I would think those are sort of the 5 categories that would be approved for research and development.
Yeah, and the kind of open one there is marijuana affiliated products, whatever that may be.
Right.
So I'd like to make sure we're at least as strict, if not stricter, than the state law, and I don't know how then we as a city provide oversight for what's taking place, or do we just abdicate that responsibility to the state?
Thank you, Mr. Matthews. Mr. Urban, you had your hand up.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I would be in support of encouraging both pharmaceutical and nutraceutical research and development within the city of Wheat Ridge, and this obviously falls well within that space, and any opportunity we have to encourage what I would propose would probably be high-paying jobs, and especially in this research and development field, I think would be appropriate. And obviously there's still some lingering questions as it relates to where and how this could be done, but I think that as it relates to some of the elements within the state legislation, specifically looking at the issue of a scientific advisory board that's reviewing some of these research and development projects that are going forward, I think we can leave that to the state to determine what's working and what's not on these particular projects, whereas the city's not really in a place to define or to provide any sort of qualified expertise to a research and development corporation as to what is appropriate to be researched and what is not. So I think the state has it well handled there, and I'd like to leave it within the state. One question I did have as it relates to the language in the bill, obviously this is very focused on the marijuana research and development and cultivation, but does this also apply to industrial hemp, and do we need to elucidate that in any way, or is that just already allowed as it relates to not being regulated?
If I may,
Ms. Berry, please.
Councilor Urban, good question. And to all the very recent comments, if and consensus is indeed to look at this further, there some of these questions you're asking that are very good are somewhat answered by the rules that the state has promulgated concerning approval of projects. Folks who review those projects and give them the green light, what kinds of things, what kinds of activities would be authorized are further defined by some regulations that have, again, already been promulgated. These kinds of licenses are authorized to be issued by the state commencing on January 1st. So that's why these rules are already in place and can help you if you want to look at further details on how the state regulates these things. Those things will be in place and effective very quickly, so we can get those to you. And to Councilor Urban, your particular question, those implementing regs specifically say testing of hemp not allowed pursuant to these R&D licenses. So that is addressed. That would be prohibited.
So, can I do follow up?
Yes.
As I understand our current regulations, we do not, within the city of Wheat Ridge, regulate the sale or the involvement of industrial hemp, and that is specifically excluded. So what would preclude someone from doing research and development on industrial hemp within the city? Even though the state legislation talks specifically about marijuana, how does that preclude someone from doing research and development on industrial hemp?
I don't think it would unless there's another particular zoning provision.
It's a good question, Mr. Urban, and we've had to answer that from people in the industrial hemp industry. I don't know if we have any R&D folks or manufacturers in that arena right now, but we've had inquiries, and the answer to them has been yes, you're permitted use in most industrial districts.
And then I guess one of the things that we can look at doing, and whether it's appropriate within the confines of the existing state regulation, is to be a little bit more scientific in the definition as to what we're doing, and that it's not so much marijuana, but it's more looking at the cannabinoid receptor antagonist and being sort of more, if we're looking actually at research and development, that we're sort of, if you classify it as cannabinoid receptor antagonist, that's more of a broad term that could be inclusive of both industrial hemp and marijuana. But as you stated, the state regulation prohibits the industrial hemp research and development at the same location. Is that?
For these, yes, pursuant to, it prohibits the testing of hemp on the licensed premise for these particular licensees. As Mr. Johnson said, if someone wanted to have that as sort of its own testing facility or as a standalone operation, that certainly would be prohibited. I don't know if there are cross-contamination issues with hemp and not, I'm not sure, Councilor Urban, but that's what the implementing regs say.
Okay.
Thank you. Mr. Fitzgerald.
First of all, I want to correct George. Gobi is not a growing business, it's an expanding business. Just to be sure that everybody understands, nobody will be coming and going. There'll be no additional traffic here. And we're very fortunate to have one of the preeminent labs in Gobi. They have dozens, I don't know exactly how many, of advanced degree people there in their lab. So Wheat Ridge is very fortunate to have them here. I want to ask a question, though, of Peter, and that is there a time frame here?
Would you please come to the podium or come to a microphone to answer that?
As far as the time frame goes, of course, as quickly as possible, because the state license goes into effect January 1st. So we will be making proposals to researchers to analyze their samples with our competitors. So our competitors mainly are in Denver. We have one competitor in Boulder, two in out southwest, but most of our competitors are in Denver. So we have 8 competitors in Denver, and so we will all be bidding on the same research projects, which right now all of us are pretty much prohibited from bidding on those research projects. So that's one reason why the bill was passed. So from a competitive standpoint, of course, we would like to be the first to get the local license and then the state license, so we can begin the process of bidding on these projects.
Thank you, Mr. Peron. Mr. Bond.
Thank you. Well, I want to make a clarification because I think this is a really important distinction inside of a larger topic, and that is that what I think we're talking about here is this business's ability to enter into the research testing part of this and be a tester for researchers. Research, thank you, just so that I'm right, thank you. So research, or researchers in general, which are contemplated by this act and obviously represent the more contemplated part of this, right? Like how do you study people, human, all this stuff that's going on. That is something we should talk about. That is harder. The reason why I believe that research testing actually is something that we have already kind of looked into and done is that a testing facility that we have a regulatory framework on, considerate of where in the city it should take place, what zone district, and what that means in terms of, again, things that we've already talked about, whether or not the public has access to it, et cetera, have already essentially been worked through. And if you quote, essentially allow for this additional piece, research, to be included into that string of things that ends with testing, starts with medical, retail, research, testing, then I think we can address at least one part of this larger issue to the point of this business specifically. The larger issue being to look at some of the other insinuations, I think, of this law that involve researchers and people, right, and all these other things, which we should figure out. But I do think there's a distinction, because I don't think that you are asking to actually engage in the research of people, but to actually to use your lab to test for research.
That's exactly right.
Thank you.
So by state law, we're already prohibited from growing marijuana. We cannot do that. We cannot sell marijuana or consume it on the premises, nor can we even be a part or partners of any business licensed Colorado company that does do that. Nor do we have any intent to do any type of clinical trials at our facility. Those clinical trials would take place at hospitals and research institutions and clinics where there are already cancer patients and other patients. We would simply test the samples before they're given to the patients to make sure that they have the potency and they're free of contaminants. And then we might also do urine and blood testing samples like that. And also we would do also testing on the effects of nutrients on plants and pesticides on plants. And the pesticide thing is a big issue and other things.
Ms. Davis.
So just real quick, I support and agree with what Mr. Pond had said. I do agree, and thank you for clarifying that as far as your role, because I do think you cannot compare drug testing and IRBs and say we have a business that does that and compare that with this testing, because one is an FDA, Health and Human Services, federal mandated process, and the other one is now going to be a new process through the state. And so I think with that in mind, you don't know that if the state has all that set up in a way. Now, don't get me wrong, I think there's a lot of drug testing that's caused a lot of problems as well, but it's a very mandated FDA federal mandate that I know, I'm guessing, because the feds won't have anything to do with anything else in the marijuana business, that they're not going to be doing it for marijuana. So I am happy to hear that clarification, and I do think as a city we need to look to make sure that that's perhaps where we start, and again, let the healthcare agencies who are used to IRB studies and those types of things follow that process until we know from a state perspective that it is well defined and monitored. Because right now, that process, you can't compare with what we do with drugs today because it's an FDA versus what our state would be doing.
Thank you. Mr. Matthews.
Yeah, could you explain to me, your last statement there, you just said that you're just going to be testing purity or testing this or testing that. How does that differ from the testing that you're doing right now, and how are our current rules and regulations within the city prohibiting you from doing this other testing?
Well, we couldn't do the other testing for the newly licensed research and development clinical trials that are going on. So right now we just do the quality control for the licensed growers and edible manufacturers and things like that. But once certain hospitals and other people, universities have obtained the research and development license, that will become another link in all of this. So that's why we need the research and development type of testing license that we can.
Okay, well that begs the question to me then is, do we need a new business license, or do we just need to expand the capabilities of the license that already exists? And that's where I was kind of headed towards.
Ms. Berry, is that a legal question that you could give us some?
Absolutely, it could. There are many ways to skin this cat, as it were, Council, and if you wish to, I believe, if you wish to expand the authorized activities of currently licensed testing facilities to include some additional testing, you could absolutely do that. Mr. Peron would have to still get his additional state license that authorizes those activities for research projects at the state level, but you could examine and consider at the city level merely authorizing those activities not as a distinct license, but rather an authorized activity pursuant to an already existing type of license, i.e. the testing license. That's an option, certainly.
Mr. Urban.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And to follow up on that, so within our current testing licensing regime, do we only allow testing on retail and medical marijuana? And because we don't allow testing on research and development marijuana, and that's what's precluding any entity from conducting testing on that particular license type product? Or how is it that we're excluding testing on any combination of marijuana, irrespective of where it was grown or how the license it came from?
It's a good question. Not quite that express, but I think we achieve that result because of the city's codes, reference to and almost incorporation by reference of the state rules and regs and the state medical and retail marijuana codes respectively, which again say no testing for research and development facilities unless you get this new type of license. So locally we say, hey, these state rules and laws applies here as well. Again, I think you have the authority to locally amend those slightly and tweak those, particularly in regards to licensed activities and where those can locate and the parameters of regulated business licenses. So I think you could amend that. I think you must be express, however.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Is there any further discussion? I had one question. The governor did not sign this piece of legislation. He let it go into law without his signature because of using or instead of and. Is that something that we would, if we were to enable this piece of legislation to go into effect in our city, would want to make it be or instead of and? I think the state will probably beat us to the punch. I think that the governor sort of gave them the message there that oversight, which was unintentional, I believe, needs to be remedied. So I think the state will get to that. It also concerns
the certification of these kinds of testing and laboratories that really is not something, again, the certification of these labs themselves, not something the city particularly delves into, Mr. Mayor. So I think for a couple reasons, we wouldn't locally have to address that. One, I think the state will get there. Two, it really concerns, I think, state regulatory issues.
Thank you.
And my understanding, it's going to be introduced, the clarifying language legislation will be introduced on January 10th, the first day of the session.
Mr. Fitzgerald, you're...
I think I've heard a consensus here. And so I was going to ask for a consensus that we direct staff to create an ordinance that is the simplest possible ordinance that we will handle on January 8th, given the time factor here. As an aside, would it bother if it were 2 weeks later or 4 weeks later?
No, whatever your recommendation is fine.
Okay, then I won't put a date on it, and let's just say I ask for a consensus to direct staff to develop an ordinance that is the simplest possible ordinance, wordsmithing if possible, to bring to us.
Okay, so there's a consensus, a request for consensus to bring enabling legislation for this new legislation. Do you have a question, Mr. Matthews?
Could I make a motion or sort of a suggestion to amend that, and that staff, when they bring that back to us, or at least in this consensus, is not tied to creating a brand new ordinance if staff decides it's not necessary, whichever is...
More of an amendment to the current license instruction.
Yeah, to give them the option to bring either or back to us rather than a brand new ordinance.
Sounds like Mr. Johnstone wants to talk to that, so.
Well, I just want clarification. I think the conversation has kind of evolved into being more kind of laser focused on this testing aspect of R&D as opposed to the R&D cultivation kind of product development aspect. I think the direction is to perhaps limit this expansion of the facilities that would be allowed somehow in the city to just that testing and not the actual R&D. So just clarification on that.
Mr. Fitzgerald.
I think there is another issue. I think everybody has brought it up. For example, what if Lutheran wants to, or somebody at Lutheran wants to do some research? And that's an entirely different issue in my mind. And I think we would need to consider that as a separate issue when that need arose. Carmen is looking flummoxed by that. Are you? No? So, all right. So, I don't know, is that where you are in this?
Yeah, to make that a separate matter, that for now we'll just address the issue at hand, which is the expanded ability to do testing associated with R&D.
Right.
Okay, so may I have a show of hands on that consensus? All right, there's consensus to move forward in that direction. Ms. Berry, thank you so much for your report. And all of Mr. Peron, thank you.
Thank you.
We will move on to item number 3. Item number 3 concerns sign code regulations. Do we have a presentation on this?
We do, which I'll hand over to Zach here shortly. We've been in front of council a couple times on the sign code, largely in response to this, what you're probably getting very familiar with these days, of this infamous Reed versus Gilbert Supreme Court decision that's actually a couple years old now, June of 2015. We were in front of you recently, and then we were back in front of the Planning Commission to basically get their direction from your direction. It will obviously require a formal recommendation by the Planning Commission at some point in time, hopefully sooner than later. And to that end, they had some kind of questions back to you. So we're going to try and limit our scope of discussion to really things that we believe not to be a settled kind of direction from council. And of course, this is a new topic to our new council member, so she may have questions. But with that, I'll turn it over to Zach.
All right, so
Zach, would you introduce yourself for the public record?
oh sure, yeah. My name is Zach Wallace-Mendez. I'm a planner with the Community Development Department.
Thank you.
Yep. So as Ken said, we're back with the sign code with some more input from the Planning Commission based on your input from the previous study session. Quickly, background, we've gone over this several times, but like Ken mentioned, the Reed versus Town of Gilbert decision, which essentially said content-based regulations are unconstitutional per the First Amendment. And so really the regulatory framework that we're looking at is time, place, and manner. So in May, we got direction from you to move forward with those updates, as well as some other items that council mentioned. Came to you in October for a study session for more direction on those issues, and then in November went to the Planning Commission for their input, and that's where we are today. So on this list here, kind of these check-marked items are areas where council gave pretty clear direction and Planning Commission agreed with that direction, and kind of we can put those matters to bed and kind of we don't need to talk about those anymore. There's 4 issues where either council decision was split and there was a tie that was broken or Planning Commission gave us some different feedback based on your input. So we want to kind of iron that out before we present a formal code ordinance to you. So the first one was yard signs for residential properties. So I think the first time we came here, it was maybe not clear that these were for residential properties and not commercial properties. So this is yard signs for residential property. So we created, as you may remember, this new content-neutral yard sign category, which was intended to capture some of the content-based categories that we had before, like political signs, community event signs, things like that. Staff had originally recommended 1 small yard sign per residential property with allowance up to 3 signs leading up to an election, just to give people more flexibility. During our October meeting, council provided input that we didn't want to regulate anyone's ability to put any number of signs in their yard, so it's kind of an unlimited number within your residential property. Planning Commission expressed their concern over that, mainly due to just thinking forward about a proliferation of yard signs and the ability to circumvent other sign regulations, such as a home occupation. You're allowed a 2 square foot sign, and then one of the planning commissioners brought up, well, if I can only have a 2-foot sign, but I can have all these signs in my yard, then it's kind of circumventing the home business sign limitation, just as one example. So in the spirit of kind of preserving neighborhood integrity and reducing visual clutter, they kind of asked City Council to consider placing a limit on the number of yard signs with a more permissive allowance leading up to any election date. So I think what we originally had thrown out to the planning or to the City Council was, something like September 1st through November 30th, you could have 3 yard signs. Planning Commission didn't like that. They're very aware that elections don't always happen in November. There's primaries, there's special elections, things like that. So they suggested, a more limited number of yard signs year round, and then 30 days, for example, before any election, you can have a little bit more to kind of express your views on that upcoming event. So that's kind of, they didn't give any specific numbers. The 30 days that I just gave was more of an example, but they just kind of kicked it back to you with that recommendation, and if you'd like to consider that moving forward.
Are we sort of going on these item by item?
Sorry, yeah.
Okay, so you want to do it as, is there,
Yeah.
Mr. Urban?
I guess I'm just somewhat confused as to why these specific issues would be brought to City Council in a study session and then brought back to a planning commission for further discussion, and why it wasn't done the other way around, where planning commission was provided an opportunity to provide input and then it was brought to us, so that there isn't this sort of back and forth. And as though we're not really sure who's, you know, involved in making these decisions. And I appreciate the input that the Planning Commission's provided, but you know, on this specific point, I only count about 56 days in the calendar year that don't have a election involved with it. As it relates to special districts, that election cycle begins on January 1st. The special district elections are on May 8th, and then you go into the primary season, and then you have the general election. So as you look at the calendar, there's only about 56 days, and our current political sign ordinance says you have 7 days to take down a sign, so it's really only 49 days out of the year that aren't necessarily involved in an election. So, you know, to that point, I don't see how you can sort of devise a way to limit someone's ability to participate in any election by a certain date, certain time frame. So I would be in favor of sticking with the consensus that we previously made, which is to not limit the number or the amount of signs in a yard.
Would you like to respond to that, or we can continue to go ahead and have questions?
I mean, I think let me just respond to the procedural comment. The reason for the back and forth was, I think, on the more macro issues of how comprehensive should we be in amending our sign code, we really wanted city council policy direction on some of those high level issues. And then we took it to Planning Commission. I think the Planning Commission's doing what they're designed to do, which is kind of dig in the weeds a little bit. And that's why they had some, you know, different ideas on a few of these things that you've given us the kind of high level policy direction on. As to a solution for this issue at hand, I mean, obviously it's council's call. Planning Commission makes your recommendation. In this case, they're making your recommendation informally as part of a study session, and then they'll make you a formal recommendation on their opinions on this matter after their Planning Commission public hearing. You know, there's probably other solutions. You make a good point about the various different elections. It might be really hard for our code enforcement folks to manage, but there still could be, I think, a bright line number. I think the biggest concern of the Planning Commission was just flat out, this might get abused. And, you know, you might have some residential areas that become kind of trashed up, if you will, with a bunch of signs, political or otherwise.
Mr. Ann?
I still support how I felt in the beginning, that if I want to put 20 signs in my yard, I should be able to put 20 signs. If I want to do 50, I could do 50. I've never done that. But there's going to be some that maybe will put more than, you know, than maybe what we want. But I think limiting how many you can put in your residential property isn't our job. Sometimes you have several candidates you want to support or issues, and it's going to take more than, you know, 3 to 5 signs. And to limit it into a certain time of year or before an election, I don't think that's our job to do. So I still support not putting a limit on that. Thank you.
Mr. Matthews?
Along those lines, the only thing that really irritates me sometimes is when someone puts up 20 signs in their yard for the same candidate. You know, and maybe that would be approached to cut down on some of the spread, if you will, is by, you know, and our lawyer just left, but, you know, if you could limit that 1 sign per candidate or something, I don't know if you can do that, but.
It's content based.
So you know, that's.
No.
Other discussion?
You're not saying they can't have a sign, just saying that they're.
You have to read it.
Many.
You have to read it to decide whether it's too many.
Well, I had a question on that, and I wanted to know if I'm a political candidate, I'm limited to a small sign, and my realtor friends and the leasing agents are able to have a large sign. But that, to me, that's a content-driven change, I mean, or difference. That one is a political sign, the other is a real estate sign. Looks to me like we're talking about content with respect to how I'm allowed, which sign I'm allowed to have.
Zach, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think the way we've kind of worked around that, it's been kind of tricky on some of these, but they would be allowed to have that larger sign under a few specific conditions, such as having an active listed property for sale or for lease.
Could I just have a political sign, you know, during the political campaign season?
That's what we're, I think, determining here today.
I mean, because to me, that really limits the message that's being sent rather than the sign or the size of the sign or the number of signs. But, Mr. Pond.
specifically, I think you're talking a little bit about the distinction between yard sign and large sign, or different signs, right?
Well, yard signs come in two sizes, small and large.
Got it.
That's what I was looking at. Ms. Davis.
I would just support our initial discussion as well. I think it's hard to mandate. I don't see people really abusing it. And again, I think it kind of goes to bulk playing. If somebody has a big yard and I'm on the corner and I can put one on this side and one on that side, and, versus my little, I think it's just somewhere we don't need to go.
Thank you, Ms. Davis. Ms. Dozman.
So I will revert back to my individual property rights and say that I do not feel like we should be limiting this, and it's not something that we can mandate and enforce. So I think that our consensus prior should hold true.
Additional discussion?
Do we need a consensus on that?
Be my guest.
I'd like to make a consensus to remain with the existing consensus that we previously made.
That seems to have a consensus among the council. Does that?
We will emphasize to the planning commission that the consensus.
Please, okay. All right. We will, with that, repair to item number 4 in our. Oh, I'm sorry, Ms. Dozman.
Sorry, I just, you brought up a good point that I just wanted to have some clarification on as far as realtor signs go. I was kind of looking through this. How are those regulated, categorized?
So those would fall under the yard large category that we had to create. So the location says allowed only on properties with active listings for sale or rent, or on properties with active building permits. A lot of times, construction companies like to put up a sign saying who's doing the work. So those are allowed separately from the small yard signs.
So would we then see the roofing signs grow in size and in duration?
Most of the roofing signs that I've seen would fall under the yard small. So you could have your political candidate sign and your roofing sign and your plumber sign.
Those wouldn't be a construction sign?
Well, sure, if they wanted to put a big sign, then technically they could fall under the active building permits category of the yard large.
But I guess,
Mr. Urban.
I guess how do you determine that it's a real estate sign without looking at it?
We don't look at the sign, we just look if the property has an active listing for sale or rent.
But if it's, I guess, if it's a sign in the yard, how is it that you're, I get what's the size for a small yard sign then?
Not to exceed 4 square feet. And then the large, well, it's a little different. So for single family, let's see, low density residential and multifamily, 3 to 9 units, it's 9 square feet. For large multifamily, it's 32 square feet. And then for non-residential, it's also 32 square feet.
Yeah, but at that, in any regard, you would have to be looking at the content of the sign to differentiate between the two to determine if that's small or large.
So I think how we would approach that is, does it fall under this definition of yard large? Yes, check. And then is it between 4 and 32 square feet? Yes. Then does it have an active listing for sale? If not, then it should be the yard small. If it does have an active listing for sale, then they're okay to be within that 4 to 32 feet. We don't care what the sign says. It could say for sale, it could say vote for whoever, because we can't look at content, but if it's an active listing for sale and it meets kind of the definition of yard large.
That falls under the manner, time, place, and
Time,
manner.
place, and manner, yeah.
Ms. Dozman?
What about wayfinding signage for like an open house? Like what would that fall under?
Yeah, so probably yard small. I mean, it just kind of depends. I think most of them are just the small yard signs, and it gets complicated.
And the challenge is, I mean, I think Wheat Ridge, like probably the majority of communities, just kind of looks the other way and hopes that that industry kind of self-regulates and cleans up after themselves. A lot of them go in the right of way. You know, I don't know how actively code enforcement picks them up on the weekend. I mean, it's a totally legitimate comment, but we essentially just kind of let that industry self-regulate and hope it doesn't become a problem.
Because I definitely would not want to regulate wayfinding signage for potential homeowners, you know, that are looking to buy in our community. And I know just recently, like a couple weekends ago, I saw an open house sign on 44th and Dudley, pointing into the direction of a house that, you know, was for sale. And I want people to have the opportunity to find that. So, like, I mean, how are we going to regulate and enforce that?
I mean, I think Zach's absolutely right. I mean, they'd be a small sign, so we wouldn't, you know, you've directed us to allow an unlimited number of those. The bigger challenge is when they get stuck in the public right of way, and they can be a hazard at some point if they're a visual obstruction.
Ms. Davis?
And I think that's a double-edged sword. I mean, I do think realtors tend to regulate themselves. They put the balloons up, they put the sign up, then they take it when they leave. So I think that's good. And I think it is something that we somewhat want to regulate, because you also have the folks that put the garage sale sign up that's there until it washes away.
Yeah.
So you'd like for our code enforcement to go by and pull that off of a, you know, pole that's been sitting there for 3 weeks and those types of things. So I can understand how we kind of, I mean, I do feel the realtors need that ability to say open house, got my balloons, go there, you know, and at the end of the day they pick it up. But I do also want the ability that when people put their open house signs that way and keep it up, that we can go and yank those.
And that's basically the way it's handled today. And I've gotten emails and calls from realtors concerned, and I told them that, yeah, we understand you put them in right-of-ways, but which is not legal, but we allow it because we know you self-regulate for the most part, and they understand that, and they say yes. In every community, we try to get it. You know, open houses on the weekend, we put them up, we take them down before code enforcement comes out on Monday, is what they tell us. But they do, if we have time, code enforcement does. If there's yard sales or garage sale signs right there posted, we try to get those down when we can. So we do regulate those a little differently.
So, Mr. Johnson, you're going to bring us back a new sign code? Is that the?
Have a couple more issues.
Oh.
3 more issues.
Oh, okay. Well, I thought we were okay. Sorry.
Wishful thinking.
What's the? You know, we're gonna take a break here in 17 minutes. So. Continue.
All right, so the next issue is freestanding signs. So in October, we asked you to consider whether the regulations for new signs should be augmented to permit only monument-based signage. So this guy on the right. Council reached consensus that required monument signs associated with new development to be monument-based. However, it was kind of split whether all new signs, even if they're not associated with new development, should be monument-based. So Mayor Jay at the time broke that tie in support of allowing more flexibility. So if this O'Reilly Auto Parts is not redeveloping, they just want a new sign, the previous consensus was to allow them to do either of these. But if the O'Reilly was scraping, scraping and rebuilding new, they would have to go with the monument sign. So Planning Commission kind of recommended that all new signs be of monument design, just for the aesthetics of the community. And so the question is, would council like to reconsider the issue based on the Planning Commission input of all new signs being monument signs, regardless of if it's redevelopment or just a new sign?
Ms. Hoppy?
You know, working on the Wheat Ridge Business District Board, we see the majority of our grants are for signs. Monument signs are extremely cost prohibitive for some businesses. They are expensive. And some people get away with things that are called a monument sign, which are basically just bricking from the bottom up to the top of their pole sign. So I think that it's important that we have variety. And if someone were to do, and we'll talk about it further on, but an iconic sign wouldn't maybe necessarily look great in a monument sign. It might have to maybe be attached to a pole, depending on if it's a long, large type, long-ish icon. So I think that I think it's important to allow the flexibility and having pole signs and monument signs, along with, you know, we'll be talking about blade and icon signs too.
Mr. Fitzgerald?
Well, I must respectfully disagree. When I sat on the Wheat Ridge Business District, we gave grants to people who essentially had 50 and 60-year-old signs that looked terrible. And essentially the grant we were giving them was to help them pay for new plastic and new letters in the existing 50-year-old frame. And it looked terrible to start with, and it looked terrible to end with. So I do agree with Ms. Hoppy that signs are amazingly expensive. It's hard to believe how expensive they are. And I also agree that it could be a burden on some businesses. But I would rather go with monument signs than pole signs. And if we're going to have pole signs, I'd like to have an end date that they be amortized so that at a certain date they could no longer be renewed. So after, let's say, 10 years or 15 years, they'd have to be renewed if they want to make any change to it. So that would be the way I'd approach it, trying to find a middle road.
Ms. Duran.
Thank you. I support our decision that we made last time. We need to be flexible. Cost was a big issue, and you know, we've got property rights to think about too. So I stand behind what we decided last time. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Pond?
I agree with the flexibility, and maybe this is how I'm looking at it tonight, and we're using a slightly different language. I agree also, though, if we're saying if it's a brand new sign, that sign becomes a monument sign. But I think largely renovations, cleaning up, etc., I think it's acceptable in a broad range to allow renovation to occur at the pole. But so I think it's a definition of quote new. In my mind, if you're you know, there has to be a certain percentage or amount of the existing infrastructure, the base, the pole, etc., that you're retaining for, you know, for it to continue to look like a renovation. And at some point, once you abandon enough of that, it should be considered a new sign, and the new sign should be a monument sign. So I think that's where we were, you know, which is, you know, and if that was that, I'm still there.
Ms. Davis?
I would support our initial decision as well. And I think for everything that was brought up, but I do think that there's sometimes that the pole sign is better. I think the example I used last time was McDonald's just got, you know, remodeled, and they have a brand new sign, and it's on a pole, and it looks just fine. I don't know that you could have McDonald's make a monument sign. I mean, I think sometimes, and again, flexible with the new build, but even if that was a new McDonald's, I'd be like, why would they want a monument sign, you know? So, but I would go with our initial decision as well, that there is the variety. And I guess if we're going to give sign grants, I think maybe we just need to be a little bit more picky on what we give grants on.
Mr. Urban?
I would like to make a consensus to stick with the existing consensus that we previously made.
Okay, so the consensus is to stay with the existing consensus. Is there consensus on that consensus? It looks as though there is a majority consensus on that. Okay. Next item.
Okay. The next one's non-conforming signs. So as a reminder, in this example, which is not in Wheat Ridge, it very well could be, but it is not. I didn't want to pick on any one particular business. So as an example, you know, this pole sign clearly looks like it's too close to the right-of-way, perhaps too tall, too large, or, you know, where it should be monument-based. In the current code, it is, you know, non-conforming because it's pole-mounted. So in October, City Council reached a consensus that a schedule should be created for amortizing these existing non-conforming pole signs. Planning Commission did agree, and they proposed a 3-year amortization schedule for non-conforming signs. They also added, which based on our last conversation, I think I know how it's going to go, but we'll see. They also added a recommendation that all existing pole signs be amortized within 10 years in an effort to improve the visual character of the community. So there's kind of 2 questions there. If you think, their 3-year recommendation for non-conforming pole signs is appropriate, and then if you want to venture into the territory of amortizing all existing pole signs.
What was the original when we decided in study session?
It was just to create a schedule for amortizing. There was no
It just didn't have a date to it.
Correct.
Okay.
Yep. So they kind of recommended 3 years.
Okay.
Back to you.
Okay, discussion on this issue. Ms. Hoppy.
I mean, for non-conforming pole signs, not all pole signs, I can support that we work with getting them updated. I don't think that 3 years is long enough. And I don't think that our community should be all monument signs. And we are not Highlands Ranch for a reason. And I think there are actual places where monument signs just don't work. And so I don't think that we should make our entire community go to monument signs. So does council support a 10-year amortization of all pole signs? For me, that's a big no. A time frame for non-conforming pole signs, I'd like to push that probably closer to 5 years.
Other discussion? Ms. Duran.
Just wanted to say I agree. I think 5 years is a good time frame, and no on the second also.
Mr. Urban?
Do the current owners of the non-conforming pole signs, are they aware that it's non-conforming as it stands? Or how will they be identified and notified of their non-conforming status?
Many probably do not know that they're non-conforming, and we'd have to probably do some sort of analysis to identify which signs are non-conforming and make sure that they're put on notice, if we move forward with this schedule, that they're going to have 5 years essentially to come into conformance.
Do they need an annual, do they get an annual permit for these, or is there any other? So no. Once you get a sign, you get a sign forever, and you never do anything with it?
It's possible,
okay.
Yep.
And I guess, just to that point, without knowing who's affected or how many businesses are affected, in essence, a sign is designed in its very nature to encourage commerce within our city, which benefits our sales tax, and by limiting or otherwise constricting the use of signs, regardless if it's a pole sign or a monument sign, and getting into this foray here is interfering with commerce. And so I would be reluctant to consider either of these time frames, and definitely wouldn't want any amortization for all pole signs, and I'd be reluctant to set any time frame for all non-conforming signs as it stands now, given the simple fact that they don't even know that it's non-conforming at the present time.
Ms. Davis.
I would support what Zach just basically said, and which was kind of our initial motion. But I think a lot of it, I look at this more as, is this a carrot or a stick? And of all people, I tend to be a stick person. But in this case, I would almost want to be more of a carrot person and maybe identify those people that are non-conforming, open it up to, get them with the Wheat Ridge Business District and some like, hey, this is non-conforming and this is a discussion we had. Because if I'm hearing correctly, what I could do if I was this business owner is like cut my pole off a little bit and stick it back 5 feet, and it will still be my ugly sign that's, okay, now it's not in the right of way anymore. It's not too tall, and it's still pole mounted because we're going to allow that because it's not new construction. So it's almost like you might not get the outcome you want by going, okay, 5 years, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to just cut the stump and move it back 5 feet. Whereas if we kind of did a carrot more type of thing, it might be like, hey, you're non-conforming, and here's a program we have, and here's some things that might help your business, and do it that way versus you got 5 years and bust it,
If I may comment on that, I mean, I think that's certainly an approach that we would propose to you if there's direction to amortize some signs, non-conforming signs, you know, is maybe on the table here. You know, we'd come back to you and, you know, I don't know if it's 2018 or points beyond, but we need to do a pretty big staff research project of identifying the scope of the problem, and then get that in front of you, try and put some numbers to it, and kind of get direction from you whether you want to incentivize this. I mean, to the extent that, I mean, if you had the resources to budget for it over the course of the next 5 years in a matching grant program or something like that, I mean, I think we would definitely want to do it in that type of a collaborative manner.
Mr. Fitzgerald?
Well, we do have a carrot. We do have carrots through the Wheat Ridge Business District, and we could improve those carrots. And that's probably a good idea because, as Ms. Hoppy said, signs are outrageously expensive. So I would support if the Wheat Ridge Business District came to us and asked for more money as a carrot. I would support that. But and I also want to point out, I guess, talk against my own opinion here. But if we amortize a sign, and if the owner of that sign wants to change something on that sign, if we're going to make them do a whole new sign, that's an inducement not to renew his sign. So, you know, that's a negative about amortizing signs. However, I would like to amortize pole signs. We're not talking about the non-conforming signs, but I'd like to amortize pole signs, but we could extend that out many, many years further. So if somebody comes from us 25 years from now, or comes to the Wheat Ridge Business District 25 years from now, and asks for money to renew a pole sign, by that time, I think you could consider that sign has had its day. And I think you could amortize it then. So I would like to amortize, but over a much longer period. Amortize pole signs over a much longer period.
Mr. N.
Thank you. How much does the Wheat Ridge Business District grant and give in grants for signs?
Sorry, I don't have those numbers with me.
Okay, not even an idea of how much?
No, I mean, it's something we just did $50,000 on major facade projects for 3 projects. I mean, I can't really, we get $45,000 a year from the city. So for me to break down how much of that goes to facade, landscape, paint, ADA updates, or signs convert from pole to monument, or pole signs that are upgraded, I can't give you that.
Okay, I'm just trying to get an idea of how much more we would need to put in.
So this would be my
really
suggestion.
Make a difference.
Yeah. So my suggestion would be, you know, when the ADA compliance stuff came down, the city council gave a kind of a big lump sum to the business district, and that was earmarked for ADA.
Mm-hmm.
And then beyond that, then we, you know, so we had several applications at that point.
Mm-hmm.
And then beyond that, we just maintained the ADA grant program, and so it's part of all of our grant programs. My suggestion is, and I'll talk to the board of directors on the first Thursday of January about it, but that we would probably look at something like having its own category, which would be non-conforming sign conversion. Which would be different than someone just getting like an updated sign, or someone upgrading or getting a new signage from, you know, maybe a small pole into a larger monument, which is some of the sign stuff we do. So.
Yeah, I think that would be great. And also to bring us the information as to how many are non-conforming. I mean, we could have, I don't know, 10,000. We could have, I just don't know, to make a good decision too, so.
Are we ready on a consensus on this? Would someone like to offer consensus, Ms. Hoppy?
Yeah, I'd like to try to find a consensus to move forward with well, I mean, we pretty much decided we didn't want to amortize the existing non-conforming. I would like to make a consensus that the staff comes to us at a future date with the information and research on how many non-conforming signs are in Wheat Ridge, so that we can make a more educated decision on non-conforming signs.
Can I suggest adding just one thing? If the Wheat Ridge Business District could, if by then you'll have an idea, since you're going to make a separate fund for this, give us an idea of what would be needed.
I guess I would say until City Council says for sure we have to get rid of non-conforming signs, that we wouldn't actually add that grant to our list of grants. We do already have a pole conversion to monument sign grant where you get more money if you convert a pole sign to a monument sign versus if you're just updating a pole sign. So I guess the non-conforming pole signs, if we don't know how many there are, then we wouldn't really know how much we would need or how to really structure that grant. But I will have that conversation with the business district board in January.
Well, Ms. Davis, do you have a question? Because we sort of have a consensus notion on the,
I have a question and a consensus. It's kind of a point of order or a point of issue. So my understanding is that Ken and Zach, they need some answers to how this ordinance is going to read, this sign code is going to read, so we can present it for approval. Is that correct? So I think the thing is by us making action items of let's see how many non-conforming signs and those types of things, will that delay this? So I guess from a process question, is that something that instead we have a consensus, like here would be my consensus, is to keep it how it was without an exact date until we get some of this further information, and then we can change it then, I guess is my question of what you're
based on what I heard from Ms. Hoppy's motion, we would be kind of punting on any code amendment that would amortize non-conforming pole signs, and we'd be coming back to you at some point in the future with a scope of problem for you to make a decision as to what that would look like.
Kind of our original consensus that we made at the previous study session, with just the addition of let's get some homework on if we're going to put some timeline on it.
Yeah, I think we were, the proposal to date has been, if council supports it, we were going to do the non-conforming in this ordinance, so actually start that amortization period, but then come back to you, at least in our minds, with some sort of a programmatic approach. So based on the consensus motion that's on the table, we would kind of flip-flop that order. We'd come back with you to a program and a potential minor sign code amendment that would amortize non-conforming pole signs.
All right, so I think that's how we had it.
So the consensus would be not to. No, we're still trying to get the language. So the language on the consensus, so the concept of the consensus would be not to have an amortization schedule at this time, and to direct staff to go and do some research on non-conforming pole signs. We have consensus on that then.
All right. This is flying compared to last time.
That's because we already talked it through.
Alrighty, so I think this is the last one. Changeable copy signs, like the one pictured here that has the messages that change. They can come in LED, or most of what we see now with changeable copy signs is these LED signage. I think originally the code was written for the kind of slide in and out letters, I don't know. But this is mainly what we're talking about, is the changeable copy LED. So in October, City Council was asked to reaffirm the restriction that we have in place that does not allow changeable copy signage in the MUN and MUC TOD zone districts. So MUN is this kind of darkish blue color, mainly along 38th, but then there's various other MUN properties across town, and then the MUC TOD is only for the TOD area, the train station area. So that's kind of this light blue color up here. There's two pieces of it. So currently the code does not allow changeable copy signs in those two zone districts. The intent of the restriction was to encourage sign designs that are more pedestrian oriented in nature. So kind of despite the current non-conforming nature of like 38th Avenue, for example, compared to what the MUN wants it to be. So in October, council was split, and Mayor Jay at the time broke the tie to keep the existing code language prohibiting changeable copy in MUN and MUC TOD. Planning Commission agreed with the prohibition in these zone districts. Given the goals and objectives for these corridors, we thought we would bring it back just because it was a split decision, and we now have a new mayor and a new city council member, so we want to make sure that this is the clear direction, since last time it was split. So there's a follow-up to that, but I guess I'll ask that question first.
Discussion from the council. Maybe you better go and you should do your follow-up question first.
Okay, so the follow-up is more of a, do we want to create a carve-out? So kind of in between the October City Council study session and the November Planning Commission study session, we were approached by the school on 38th Avenue, and I'm blanking on the name, even though, thank you, I've been there several times, Stevens Elementary, about putting a changeable copy sign, up on their property. They've come to us saying, you know, this school have all done it in Jefferson County. It's a big thing for schools to do and to advertise. So we went to Planning Commission with that information and just said, is this a carve-out that you would be willing to consider? You know, to allow changeable copy signage on, you know, publicly owned land or something to that effect, which the school district would be. And they had no objection to creating a carve-out so the school could have a sign. So that was the follow-up question.
All right. Bless you. Mr. Matthews.
Well, I'm kind of a big believer in what's good for the goose is good for the gander. If we're going to say you can't do it over here, why do we always get carve-outs for government? I'm against that.
Mr. Pond.
Going in the order, I think, which is I do think that how we looked at it, or at least how I looked at it before, is how I still feel about it, which is that I do think there is some intent in these districts, and I think that changeable copy is a reasonable exclusion based on that intent, and so I would stay with that. I'm not necessarily opposed to the carve-outs, I suppose, if they make sense, and the school, you know, a school's request potentially could be reasonable. So I'm not opposed to it as a carve-out.
Mr. Fitzgerald.
I'm not opposed to having a changeable sign at the school. However, we have previously talked about a city project on the grounds in front of the school, and I believe we have somewhere a concept drawing. Is that correct? Do we have a concept drawing?
There were some different concept drawings done for the property in front of Stevens Elementary, and some of those concepts included a similar sign, such as this, to be used for school use and or city use.
Was that sign on close to the street or on the school?
It was probably in public. I don't know. It could have been on public right of way and or school property. It would be close to the street so people could see it driving by. I don't know if it was right of way or school property.
Well, I would suggest that I would be in favor of allowing the school to have a changeable copy sign, but I think they should coordinate with whatever plans are possible for a public project on that site, so that they don't have to tear it down, or we don't have to tear it down later.
Mr. Urban.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I guess as it relates to a previous discussion we had, how does this square with the issue of it being a content-based sign, and that it is we're dealing with a particular use of property to determine what kind of sign is allowed, and therefore we're sort of allowing this use because of the type of we're allowing this sign based on the type of use on that land. So isn't that a content-based judgment on that?
it falls under time, place, or manner. So it'd be creating a carve out for a specific land use. So just like we have different regulations for commercial uses versus residential uses, there would be a carve out for a school district use, or public or semi-public, however we word that in the code already, use. So it's just saying that use can have this kind of sign. We don't care what the sign says, but they can have that kind.
So I guess the follow-up question on that would be as it relates to the use of the land and whether it's publicly used or privately used for educational purposes. Would a sign of this similar nature be allowed on a private school property as much as is allowed on a public school property?
I suppose as we've worded it, or as I just worded it, no, because it wouldn't be publicly owned. So if you want to, if you think the carve out is acceptable, but you want to kind of change how we just threw it out at you, I think that's okay, as long as we stick with the use and not specific. Yeah, exactly.
Well, I guess my concern overall is that these signs should be allowed where either a business or a religious institution or a public entity would desire them to be based on their own needs. They're not putting it out there just to spend money. They're putting it out there for some benefit or purpose, for their own benefit or purpose. So I wouldn't necessarily be in favor of limiting these signage in the MUN or MUC zone districts as it stands, but if we're going to go down that road, then I would ask that we consider changing this carve out to be a little bit more broad as it relates to the type of use being used, because it does seem to be somewhat hypocritical to have the government say you can't use these signs, but we're going to use them. So it just, I think that's something that needs to be done delicately.
Thank you. Ms. Dozman?
Thank you. I will just reiterate what Larry and Zach have said. I agree that it's very hypocritical for us to say that we will not allow it within these districts, but then we will do a carve out specifically to 38th Avenue, which seems to be the reason as why we prohibited it in the first place. So I agree. I have been approached by members of the Stevens community about wanting this sign specifically, and I would like to see them be able to, but I'd also like us to not regulate it within the MUN and MUC TOD districts if we are going to allow for this carve out.
I had a question. Would the carve out include any schools, any public property, any city-owned property in the city, or just in these zone districts?
Well, the prohibition is only in these zone districts, so the carve out would be kind of specific to that exclusion.
Okay. So they're allowed in other zone districts. So other schools in other districts could have that.
Right, which is why Stevens is approaching us like, why are all these other schools getting the signs? Because they're not zoned MUN like Stevens is.
Thank you.
And you see a lot of churches using them now too.
Correct, yeah.
Ms. Hoppy.
I'm personally not a huge fan of the changeable copy LED signs, especially when they're in like residential areas and glowing into people's kitchen windows all night. But I do see why I wasn't here for the original study session, but I do see why there was kind of a mixed bag on whether it should be in the mixed-use neighborhood or the mixed-use commercial TOD zone districts, because you're trying to create something that's a little less, I guess, flashy, and a little less Las Vegas happening there. But I think it's important for the school to be able to also use those messaging, sign messaging. My children's elementary school doesn't have one, but the high school does. And oftentimes I get a lot of information from that sign that I should be getting from my kids. And so, I do see like the importance of it for a school. So I guess with that said, I would say that I support the original consensus of not allowing them in the mixed-use neighborhood and the mixed-use commercial TOD zone districts. And I would also support the carve-out for educational, for schools, so private schools and public schools and charter schools.
Ms. Duran?
Ken, can you refresh my memory? Didn't we discuss last time too the brightness of some of these lights, so that with this you're able to test that, so that if, considering the one on 32nd that we have, right, you're able to go and test, and if it's not where it's supposed to be, there's actually something you could do about it. Your hands aren't tied.
Correct.
Correct?
Yeah, so we've added that, we've added that language, or we will add that language based on your input and Planning Commission's input. We didn't talk about it tonight because it was pretty clear consensus from both groups, but that language will be going in there, and then at some point some sort of action item for the city to buy the luminance meter, so we're able to measure that, yeah.
Okay, and on...
Council's direction was also to amortize those as well, so that I think it was 3 years. Council wanted those to all be, or maybe it was even tighter than that.
2.
To change to that new technology.
Yep.
Okay, so considering a consensus on here, do we need to put in specific language for private schools, charter schools? Do we need to add that in here? Or just school district? Or just schools?
Yeah, I think educational.
Educational?
Land, uses.
Educational land uses?
Mm-hmm. We'll confer with.
Would that include something like a daycare school or
Oh, that's true. Dancing school, that's true.
Mr. Pond?
Thanks. Can we maybe just get our feet on the ground and go back? Because I think one of the requests was for us to reassert our original consensus to continue the prohibition of changeable copy signs in MUN and MUC TOD. So can I ask for that consensus? Well, no, to prohibit changeable copy signs in the zone districts where they're currently prohibited, which is MUC TOD and MUN.
Okay, so we have a consensus going to prohibit these in the MUN, MUC TOD.
To continue the prohibition.
Continue the prohibition.
Right. Is that, did we have?
Okay, let's, please put your hands up if you're in favor of that consensus. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. All those opposed to that consensus? Okay, that's why I'm asking people to.
There were 5.
1, 2.
No, this is 4.
1, 2, 3. Okay, 5, so that's a.
So just a thought on the educational aspect. We, in our definitions earlier in chapter 26, we define educational facilities separate from daycares. So I think what we would do is probably borrow some of that language to distinguish those uses and put them in this definition chapter, just so it's abundantly clear that this is what we're talking about when we mean educational land use.
Point of order, Mr. Mayor. Didn't we already have a consensus on the floor before George's? No? Okay. I withdraw.
What if we created a carve-out for Stevens Elementary School and not deal with all the broad educational categories in the MUN and MUC TOD sites? Does that get us where we want to be? I mean, we have one school there. Would, you know, Ms. Davis?
I guess I agree. I mean, I think I drive by Wheat Ridge High School and I don't even have kids and I read the darn sign, you know, when they're out for break and, you know, things like that. So I do see value in those signs. I also see value in not wanting a bunch of flashy signs in a mixed-use neighborhood type of district because, like, the only thing I can think of right now, and I think Ms. Duran had kind of mentioned it, is, or I think Ms. Hoppy, is the whole point is we don't want it to be, like, in people's, like, front yards or kitchen windows. And I'm just thinking, okay, we're going to build, you know, we've got Wazi Partners going to build a nice apartment area right across from there. So I'm just trying to be mindful that some of this might not seem mixed use right now because we don't have a lot of apartments above buildings, or maybe we have a few and we don't have some of these. these other apartments, well, we do a little bit across the street. Excuse me, Ms. Schaefer. We do have a couple across the street, but I think that that's the one thing is that as we do this and we do a carve out, then I worry about, again, the whole point of the mixed-use neighborhood and those types of things and what we're trying to avoid. So I understand why the school wants it, and I think there's a good purpose there. I mean, part of me is like, well, can we just place it in a way that's, you know, but it's it's just overall, it's a tough call.
Mr. Urban.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I guess as it relates to what we're doing here, we're looking at codification of amendments to our sign code, and I don't know that that's the time or place to look at a specific entity's variance request or sort of carve out. And so, you know, is there any mechanism for a variance in this instance if this code were to go forward, or how does somebody request that?
Yeah, there is, and we actually granted a variance, didn't we, for the Methodist Church across the street? Or I'm not sure if they've acted on that yet, but they had a really good case or argument because they were zoned MUN, but arguably they could have been as easily zoned MUC, and it would have been allowed. So they had a kind of a unique set of circumstances. But yes, we do allow variances to that section of the code. It's an option as well.
So I guess, you know, as you look at just the mechanics and the procedures of this, not necessarily on the merits of whether Stevens should be allowed to have a sign or not, and I think Stevens should be allowed to have a sign. But as we're looking at this process here and now, I don't know that this is the place where we should be looking at specific instances, because as valuable and as needed as a sign is for Stevens, there's cases for any number of properties in the city as it relates to sign usage. So I think we need to just be mindful of the mechanisms we have in place to allow for that as needed.
Is there any other business on the sign code on item number 3?
No, just I guess a consensus on this carve out or not.
I think we had consensus. Oh, not on the carve out? Ms. Hoppy?
So with what Mr. Urban's saying, and I just want to clarify, if we put in the sign code that that there's no changeable copy LED signage in the mixed-use neighborhood, mixed-use commercial TOD zone districts, that the school could come and ask for a variance to get their sign. Is that true?
Zach and I are maybe remembering this a little differently, so we might need to look into that a little more. So I don't know if we might need to get back to you when we actually hold the public hearing on this, but
Mr. Urban.
So just real quickly, as it relates to the school district property, does the zoning district apply to that property?
It is zoned MUN.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just clarifying.
We did confer with the city attorney that the sign code does apply to them, if that's what you meant, with the school district kind of being exempt from certain aspects.
Yeah, I'm thinking about state-owned properties having, you know, sort of understanding that are there certain properties within the city that our zone regulations don't necessarily apply, and therefore this may not even apply to them, and they could go out and do whatever they wanted, and we wouldn't be able to do anything.
The only carve out is for school districts, but it's
please use the microphone.
Yeah, sorry. The only carve out is for school districts, and it doesn't. It only applies to the location of schools, so we can't tell the school, no, you can't locate there because it's zoned A1, but we can regulate them in a lot of other ways on things like this.
Okay.
Drainage, traffic upgrades, you know, signalization, those sorts of technical issues.
Okay, so in an effort to sort of move this discussion forward, does the council support an allowance for LED and changeable copy signage on publicly owned land? Is there
or other carve-outs?
Or other carve-outs on that? Is there a consensus for that? Doesn't appear that we have a consensus for that. Ms. Hoppy?
How staff is going to get back to us and let us know if the school can ask for a variance?
Yeah, we'll get back to you on that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Alrighty, so that was it. Next steps is to incorporate all of the input that we've received from council and planning commission, add some images, staff and city attorney review, which will take a little bit. So I think the dates on this slide are a little bit more realistic than what was put in your packet. Perhaps a planning commission public hearing February or March, kind of depending on how long the staff and city attorney review takes. And then a city council public hearing March, April timeframe.
Thank you very much. We have one more item, but we've been here for 3 hours. I think we need to sit up and take a stretch. So I think we should have a 10-minute recess.
This one shouldn't take that long.
We will, yep, 5 minutes.
Yep.
Okay. Thank you very much. We'll come back into session, and we are ready for item number 4, and this is freestanding emergency rooms. And do we have a staff presentation?
Yeah, we can
Mr.
be I think, brief on this one.
Terrific.
This is a somewhat familiar topic for council as well. We've been talking, or not talking, I guess, about freestanding emergency rooms for a couple years now. You know, it's still a relatively new business concept to the state. It's been around quite a bit in other locations across the country for many years, but really emerging just in the last few years in Colorado. And it's not without its controversy. It's gotten some media attention in terms of, you know, just some of the unique characteristics of these operations operationally, you know, what they can provide, what they, you know, sometimes can't provide. And because of that, it's been at a state level a topic of discussion, and the legislature has talking about it for a number of years now, but they haven't really gotten to the point of actually adopting legislation. In Wheat Ridge, we've determined these uses, which have a lot of similar aspects to what a hospital emergency room would have. As such, while they're not listed in the code, we think they're most similar to hospitals, and we've defined them as such from a zoning standpoint. So what that means is that they're allowed in planned hospital districts and mixed-use commercial districts, but no other districts. One had been proposed at one point in a mixed-use neighborhood district through a rezoning process, and ultimately that application was withdrawn. We certainly believe that because of kind of some of their unique land use and business concepts, there could be reasons to regulate them differently, either through the zoning code or as a licensing matter, or both. So we think it's a good discussion to have. The challenge has been just that the state's potential to discuss these and potentially regulate them fairly significantly, that it's kind of put us on high center, and we've adopted moratoriums over the past several years to kind of buy time to see if the state would take some sort of action that would inform our action, whether it would be to totally supersede local regulations in some manner, or just inform how we best regulate these to align with whatever state level regulations would be passed. We hear through our industry insiders that there's a better chance this year that it might actually gain some traction at the State House. With that in mind, we're here before you tonight to talk about whether to have a brief extension of the moratorium. You first adopted a moratorium back in April of 2016. That was for a year. A year later, or just prior to its expiration in April of 2017, you extended for another year. And frankly, those are all perfectly logical things to do. It just ends at a really awkward time, right? Because it ends right in the middle of the legislative session, which would mean we'd really need to start crafting local regulations right now, to have a study session or two with you, to get it before the Planning Commission, to get it before you as an ordinance for City Council. So we'd be doing that while the state was trying to figure their act out. So what we're trying to request from you is whether you'd like to expand it for 90 days, and that would have it expire in July of 2018, and would give us some time kind of at the end of the legislative session, not a lot, to draft an ordinance that's responsive to whatever the state does. So that's our approach. I mean, I think 90 days with that logic would kind of be the minimum. You know, depending on how late in the session they might get some resolution on it, if at all, that would be a pretty quick turnaround. We don't have to do anything. You could, you know, we could begin drafting regulations right now. We gave you that as one option as well. We're not necessarily advocating for that, obviously. You know, you don't have to do anything really at the end of the day, and the existing regulations would remain in effect, which is we treat them as hospitals, and they're allowed in mixed-use commercial and planned hospital districts, and that's it. But I think we're suggesting that it might make sense to extend the moratorium, and based on what we're hearing from people in downtown Denver.
Questions from council? Ms. Duran.
I don't really have a question, more of a comment. I would rather extend the moratorium to at least see what the state comes back with, so we're not reinventing the wheel here or trying to create it. We can at least see what they come up with. So that's what I would be in favor of.
Ms. Hoppy?
I'm in favor of extending it for 120 days.
What is the longest period of time that we can extend it out?
You know, I think the attorneys are always reluctant to, have lengthy moratoriums. There's no magic answer to that. I think as long as we're kind of actively engaged in looking at this, we're not just kind of an undefensible in perpetuity, or we're not really talking about it. We just did a 2-year moratorium, and I haven't talked to you guys about it since. We're talking about it. We're keeping you up to date on where they're at in terms of the State House. We have those channels of communication open. So in my opinion, we have a very defensible ability to extend it for, I wouldn't say a year, just because we've done it for a year twice now, but something short of a year. I think I'd be comfortable with 180 days if you think you need that much time.
Okay. And just as a, looking at all the different options, I've come up with about 10 or 15 different requirements that I think would be appropriate if we were going to allow this type of use within the city, because of this is a very unique use and it does relate to the health and safety of the citizens. So I do have about 10 or 15 different options as far as what we can do to regulate these types of entities and how they work within the city, and I can forward those on. But to me, I think it's important that we look at ways to allow them, but in such a way that they don't impede citizens' ability to get access to health care. And there's, I think, some models around the country that have worked well to provide for some regulations around these types of entities, so that we're not doing any disservice to the residents.
Other discussion? Ms. Hoppy?
I'd like to ask for a consensus that we extend the moratorium for 120 days.
There's consensus there. Does that give you the direction you need?
Indeed, thank you.
Does that complete that item? That's that completes the 4 items.
These are all my year-end performance goals. I'm trying to earn my raise for the year.
We've got to get better than three
stack
hours.
them, so
I'll
they
tell you
only have to
that,
come
so.
one night, I tell you.
Okay. Staff reports, Mr. Goff.
Real quick, in February, March, I believe, and maybe Janelle, you can comment on this. Robin asked me to ask council. In February, March, we bring back reappointments or appointments to boards and commissions, right? Boards and commissions, yes. A couple years ago, City Council created a new position, the Jeffco Library Liaison position. You did appoint a person to that. Her seat is up. Robin cannot get a hold of her. We're not sure if I don't think she's ever reported out to council. I guess the question is, is this a position you want to keep and appoint somebody new? We haven't heard back from her if she wants to be reappointed. I don't think we've had no contact with this person. This was the first person I think appointed. So when we bring back those appointments and reappointments, do you want to try to appoint somebody again, or do you want to get rid of this seat?
I'd like to appoint somebody because aren't they having some discussions moving forward? Didn't you make an announcement last week?
Yes, the mayor and I met with them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They have activities since they've got their mill levy adjusted in the county. They've got more activities, so there's. I think it's important for us to have a seat at the table, if you will.
And I think the intention of when council did create this was for this person hopefully to attend the library board meetings and then come back and report. So I think whoever we appoint, make sure maybe they have that understanding and actually come back and report. So go ahead and keep it.
Yes.
Okay.
That's all staff comments. They're expeditious. Elected officials matters. Do we have anything pressing? Okay. All right. Very good. Thank you. I had one issue I wanted to bring up. We had gotten a request from, I guess perhaps the Metro mayors, to send a letter to Senator Michael Bennett and Senator Cory Gardner concerning our support for the for the Dreamers and the DREAM Act of 2017. And I won't read the piece of correspondence, but the last, let's see, the last paragraph is, current and former mayors, we represent and represented Republicans, Democrats, and independents as you do. We are represented communities across, and we represented communities across Colorado as you do. As you know, the views expressed in this letter are shared by a majority of Coloradans. We applaud your co-sponsorship of the DREAM Act and encourage you to use every tool at your disposal to secure passage of a clean bill as quickly as possible. So this is a request, and I'll pass it around. There's probably 35 or 40 mayors on here. My question to you is that, is this something that you would like us to bring back to council on Monday for your formal consideration? You would? Is there consensus on that? Consensus, we'll bring this back to you for consideration at our next council meeting in the new year. Is there any other matter to come before the council at this study session? Hearing none, we'll stand adjourned. Thank you. Merry Christmas.